It's weird how even small moments of reprieve that we glean, moments where we're able to escape from the responsibilities thrust upon us by life, never seem to last. In fact, sometimes, by pure happenstance, our paradise becomes hell, and thus turns into responsibility. The whims of fate aren't always generous. The precipice of the events that would lead to my despair happened 2 weeks ago. My best friend Aiden had missed school for 2 days after falling ill. I went to see him the first day, which his mother was quite pleased about. Unfortunately, he wasn't up for my visit. I didn't know that would be the prelude to the ending of our bond. When Aiden came back to school, he was deathly pale. So much so, it looked like he'd been in a grappling match with the Grim Reaper. I tried to talk with him during lunch and between classes, but his standoffish demeanor gave no purchase. What made it worse was that Aiden's ghoulish appearance hadn't deterred his bullies a single iota. The teachers tried many times to stop them in the past, but when the leader of the group of misfits is the principal's son, one will only get in so much trouble. It was a week into Aiden's return that the bullying escalated. During lunch, I noticed Aiden being led into the stairwell at the back of the cafeteria. After a few minutes of debating if I should see what was going on, I followed in pursuit. The principal's son, Faust, had Aiden pinned to the wall on the basement floor. His group of cronies surrounded Aiden like a flock of scavenging vultures among carrion.
You know, I'm real tired of you staring at me all the time, freak. How about we do something about that?
The glint of a scalpel shined in the stairwell.
I hope you're not planning on actually doing anything with that. Not even your dad will be able to save you if it's found out you brought what could be considered a weapon to school.
I spoke. The harrowing group of wannabe thugs looked at me with contempt.
I'm just trying to scare the turd, is all. He's no fun anyway.
He shrugged as he let Aiden go.
Luckily, your girlfriend saved you this time, dweeb.
He bellowed before the group took off. Bounding down the stairs, I tried grabbing Aiden's hand, but he recoiled.
How nice, my guardian angel. Coming to the rescue once again.
At one point, being his guardian angel was a term of endearment. He said the very words when we first met in the park in autumn all those years ago. My mother took me on a picnic trip away from the prying eyes of my authoritative father. While setting up, we heard the cries of a frightened boy not far off in the distance. A loose dog was gnashing its teeth at him, which I promptly chased away with a stick. I can still recall how warm he was as he squeezed me, burying his face into my chest, snot ruining my favorite pink dress. A sense of elation ran through me at the time. At the ripe age of 10, I learned what it felt like to be needed and relied upon, and I clung to that, and ultimately him, being that misfortune was tethered to Aiden at the hip.
I didn't need your help. I could have handled it.
It was those 2 days you were absent, I muttered.
Not this again.
Well then talk to me, Aiden. Ever since you were absent, you haven't been the same. And look at you. You don't even look the healthiest. Spray tan isn't going to change that.
His eyes glinted with animosity. How astute, Detective. He turned and walked inside the basement. Sewer pipes and wires lined the ceiling of the corridor. To the left lay the boiler room, and there was a closed-off gate to the right, barring further entry. Priscilla, do you know why they closed this area off?
No.
The principal said the basement was never fully finished because there were too many rats down here. And perhaps there's some truth, but it's just that. A half-truth. This hallway used to function as another floor of the school. There were a bunch of abandoned classrooms and even a gymnasium at the end of the corridor just below the cemetery across the street. Chills ran up my spine.
You mean you actually trespassed?
He shrugged. It wasn't exactly hard to pick the lock.
That's not the point, Aiden. It could be really dangerous down here. You know how scary the dark is.
I stammered, balling my fist. I've been in darkness all my life. There's nothing down here that'd make things worse.
That's not true. I've been here, haven't I?
He whispered something under his breath that was hardly discernible, and I only managed to catch the tail end of it. Not when I needed you most. He pivoted to face me, hand still clutching the gate. What do you think happened here? He waited for a response that didn't come and flashed a toothy smile. Maybe all those years ago, the dead found their way down here and devoured all the kids. Stop. Maybe it's because of that school shooter that slaughtered all the children and teachers down here in the 80s, he inquired.
Aiden.
Think some of the funerals happened in the cemetery across the street? It's eerie, isn't it?
This isn't you.
He leaned in real close to me, close enough that I should have felt his breath on mine, but it was startlingly weak. I don't need you anymore. I know I might look like I'm a walking corpse, but I'd never felt more alive. The lunch bell chimed as he walked past me. I stopped interacting with him altogether after that. I'd like to say the reason I did it was out of respect, but the real reason was the brewing concoction of denial and fear. On the surface, I was scared I had lost my best friend. Underneath that, there was a more primordial inkling that did not dare surface. I focused on my responsibilities at home under my father's scalding guidance. I was at the age where I needed to join my parents, though my mother was more than supportive of me having a balanced life. Any extra time I had was allotted towards schoolwork. On occasion, memories of Aiden echoed through my head. How we often played together. The infrequent times I stayed at his house for sleepovers, staying up late into the night watching cartoons. We were two kids brought together through loneliness, both outsiders, albeit for different reasons. It was the beginning of 7th period when Miss Camille did a roll call, that the hairs on my neck stood on end. Aiden and Faust were both missing. Grabbing my backpack, I bolted out of the classroom, swiveling down the corridor as I made for the stairs. My fears were realized when I saw the gate in the basement ajar. Nothing but a sea of darkness yawned in front of me. The smell of copper wafted from the oppressive void, tinting my nostrils. Retrieving the flashlight from my backpack, I pressed forward, scuttling and squeaking. The scuttling and squeaking of rats in the pipes accompanying me through the journey of the unknown. The scent got stronger with each classroom I passed. I soon found myself upon the first corpse lying against the wall. Poor Rick's neck was torn open, fleshy strands of sinew being the only thing holding the head to the torso. A scream echoed from down the corridor. I dashed past the remaining bodies carefully to avoid slipping on the blood pooled on the ground. A hulking form had Faust pinned to the floor in the gymnasium.
Get off me, you monster! You killed them! You killed them all!
He screamed in primal despair. A demonic chuckle escaped from the beast's lips.
How have the strong fallen? Poetic justice, isn't it, Priscilla?
He asked, not even turning to look at me.
Aiden, what are you...
Help get this thing off me. I don't want to die.
A cold sweat ran down my face, knees buckling, intestines looped in knots. It was hard to breathe, and took every fiber in my being to remain standing.
As if you don't deserve to have it that easy.
Aiden snarled. Aiden's gnarled hand grabbed Faust by his jaw and pried his mouth open with the other. Then he retched. A mass of sanguine tar spilled from his mouth in a river of blood, leaving Faust no choice but to swallow the putrid iron. Faust went into a fit of convulsions before his eyes rolled in the back of his head. Aiden's neck snapped back, demonic eyes fixed on me. His towering form rose off of Faust as he began approaching me. A mist of red escaped his mouth with every exhale.
Don't worry. I didn't kill him. He'll be up soon enough. It's lonely, you know. My progenitor hasn't even showed herself since the night she turned me.
He chuckled.
I'm just that much of a burden, huh?
I backed away slowly.
What's wrong, Priscilla? It's just your best friend.
His eyes were the color of harrowing crimson, pupils slit like diamonds. Blood caked his lips, and fangs glinted in the beam of my flashlight. He began advancing on me like a lion stalking its prey. Every step he made was 1 second closer to the end. The Grim Reaper claimed him. Now he was the embodiment of death itself, and he was coming for me. What are you planning to do? Once the bodies down here are discovered, you'll be the prime suspect.
And do you honestly believe law enforcement will be able to stop me?
This can't be. I shook my head, retreating slowly. This was all one long nightmare. In a flash, he was upon me. The flashlight fell out of my hand, casting an eerie shadow as he pinned me to the floor. Bloodlust radiated from his form. The corrupt black veins in his face pulsed beneath his crimson-soaked skin.
You're so beautiful, quivering like that. My sweet angel.
His black talon traced my jawline. Pushing my face to the side, he leaned in, burying his face in my neck. He planted a kiss of death on my carotid artery, whetting his appetite.
You smell delicious.
He pulled back and licked his lips.
And I'm sure your blood will be just as wonderful. Oh, how I'd love to take a sip.
I closed my eyes, waiting for my inevitable peril.
But it wouldn't be enough, so I'll refrain from doing so.
So, you don't plan on killing me? I whispered, looking at him, tears streaming from my eyes.
Of course not. We're best friends, aren't we? I have something else in mind. If anything, it will strengthen our bond, tying us together for all eternity.
Every word undulated, reeked with decay. Dread dawned upon me as he smiled at my realization.
Bingo. Now open wide.
Bones cracked as his jaw unhinged. Carnivorous maw, a fleshy tunnel that threatened to swallow me. He pried at my lips, then a flicker of silver danced through the air, lacerating flesh as I removed the silver switchblade from my pocket. He reeled back in pain and shock, gargling on the blood that flowed down his neck like water. It took me more than one attempt to right myself. With bated breath, I ran, using all the momentum I could muster to drive my knees into his sternum, kicking him to the floor. I raised the blade above my head, screaming as I drove it into his chest. Falling back, I scrambled away as he writhed in agony. The wound in his throat already began to heal. Disoriented as I was, I fumbled through my backpack. Then I set up the purification symbol by forming the triangular boundary around Aiden with my talisman. I removed the sewing needle from my breast pocket and drew blood, marking each talisman with my life force. Taking a knee, I racked my brain to remember the incantation my mother and father used during each kill. I'd seen them do it countless times, yet it eluded me in my frightened state. I swam past the fear, the betrayal and hurt that clouded my thoughts. Finally, the words came. I recited the chant, and a pillar of light inside the purification field illuminated the gym. I don't know why, but I looked at Aiden. My heart dropped at the smile on his face. His body sizzled, starting from the bottom up. The blood on his face washed away, as if he had just been baptized. He looked just like Aiden. My Aiden.
You're really cool, Priscilla.
I never imagined you were an executioner. It all makes sense now. He looked at peace as if he was finally being relieved of his long-standing suffering. I shouldn't be surprised. I did always say that you were my guardian angel. Pain swelled inside me at his words. I so desperately tried to avoid this outcome, and the consequences were the lives of several people as a result. Do you think someone like me would be accepted? Will I finally be able to rest? Not willing to break the incantation, I didn't answer. Probably not, right? I just wanted to say. Tears rolled down his eyes.
I'm sorry. And I guess this is goodbye.
His body vanished into the ether, and the pillars disappeared, leaving nothing but my weapon behind. I'm sure you will, Aiden. I'm sure you will, I murmured, despite the teachings that said otherwise. The tears came full force, and I bawled my eyes out until something within me broke inside that dreary gymnasium. After retrieving my knife and flashlight, I beheaded Faust, not willing to risk the onset of another monster. My cell phone buzzed, and I received a text from my mother congratulating me on completing the first trial of becoming an executioner. I had failed to be his guardian angel, and now I am only an angel of death. There's a little saying in the new town I moved to. Don't move here. I wish I would have found that out sooner rather than later. Unfortunately, I had found myself in the clutches of a messy divorce that forced me to move to this small town in southern Illinois, a town called Auburndale. That alone wasn't bad. I mean, besides the fact that I have to live in Illinois, but that alone wasn't the reason for the horrific nightmare that I found myself stuck in. My current trouble was on the day of my moving into an old house, built with 2 stories, but unpainted and signs of rot desecrating the outside wood. I had on my hands a nasty case of the fixer-upper, but that might be therapeutic for me for the time being. I needed to stop thinking about her and how she ran off with my brother. I thought perhaps working with my hands would be beneficial for me in the end. If only that would have been the case. I went out to the back of the house and took a good look at the rocky cliffs behind, dropping some 50 to 60 feet. Down below was a beautiful stretch of trees that were already changing to the luscious colors of autumn, red, orange, and yellow. The crisp air was already nipping at my face, but I think I could work with this. Just have to get a heater for my bedroom. Nevertheless, I was going to have to get as much of the essential stuff running as quickly as possible. I got the house quite cheap for a reason. There was no electricity, gas, or any of the essential stuff that we needed these days. I was quickly worried about when I would take my next shower. If you were to ask anyone in town, they would say that the house was abandoned for all they knew. I had a battery-powered heater, which I hoped might last through the night, the first time ever using one of those, and I preferred to sleep in a sleeping bag on top of my bed instead of a simple blanket. It was all I could manage at this time. I also didn't want the gasoline I brought to get bad, so I left them in the living room for when winter comes. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something outside. A loud groaning sound that resembled the sounds of an elk pierced through the woods. But there was something completely off about it. The echoing never ceased, and it kept traveling through my house, as well as across the surrounding land. Never was it impeded by the trees or walls. Definitely spooky, but I didn't bother to worry about it for the time being. As far as I was concerned, it was the natural wildlife outside. After I finished making some instant coffee the next morning, I went out to the back to take in the fresh, woodland air. It seemed like the best kind of thing to do to get used to this new lifestyle that I had found myself in. Upon stepping towards the edge, I stepped on something slimy, meaty even. Hidden in the tall grass was the carcass of a mutilated animal. It may have been some sort of gopher. That I'm not too certain of, due to it appearing to have been ripped completely apart. I wasn't happy about this discovery. Already my new boots were getting blood tracked on them.
God dang it.
I shouted angrily. I was well aware that I wasn't going to get anywhere with cleaning them here. The best I could do was scrape the blood and meat off on the grass. This wasn't a pleasant sight. I was actually angry that something killed its prey in my yard.
I'm gonna need something from that store to deal with this problem,
I said. After I went back in to get ready, I heard something far off in the distance, far out in the woods, making a wailing, shrill call.
What in God's name?
I went to the window and looked out. There was nothing, same as before. At the supermarket, I was getting some raccoon repellent and some other supplies to help me fix up the house. Once I got all that, I stood in line, and immediately I ended up striking up a conversation with this man behind me.
I see you're doing a little home improvement, eh?
I turned around, trying to get my nerves that had been bugging me the entire time since I heard that sound.
Oh, there's a little something to get that water system running. I believe I have well water.
He chuckled and said, "I'm Nate," and extended his hand. I did the same as we shook hands. I replied,
Henry.
"So you mentioned that your water isn't working. Why's that?" Feeling a little self-conscious about mentioning that house. The one that's all dilapidated and an eyesore for the rest of the town when it's vintage homes that have been kept nice and well-decorated while mine is this rotten blight.
I don't know.
You don't know? He asked again.
Yeah, it's just, I don't know how to say this, but I bought the wrecked house by the cliffside.
His expression changed so rapidly once I said that, but he asked again, clearly for confirmation of what I had said. "You don't mean... Oh my God, they're still trying to sell that place?"
What's wrong?
I said, becoming increasingly unnerved by this conversation's sudden turn. He told me that we should check out first, before he explained further about an old town legend in the area. Once that was over, we stood outside the store and talked. He had such a grim tone in his voice that he didn't have before. "If I were you, I wouldn't stay in that place for a single night. You could offer me millions of dollars and I wouldn't do it."
Why's that?
The house isn't a good location, so to speak. There's been a string of murders tied up with it. Upon hearing that, I was agitated that the realtor didn't tell me about that.
I already stayed there last night and nothing happened. It could be a week, it could be a month, hell, it could take a whole year before that thing in the woods just beyond the cliffside takes notice that you're in its house. Back it up. What thing are you talking about? There's a creature living in those woods, man. And when it finds out that you're inside the house, it won't be happy. I'd say trying to get that place up and running again is going to be a dead giveaway of your presence. Well, I can't live without water and electricity. He cut me off. You shouldn't be living in that house, period. If you don't want to end up in the obituaries and an early grave, I suggest you pack up your things and book it. I can't. I have nowhere else to go. The streets would be kinder to you. But I can tell you that there's plenty of motels around here that'll let you stay. Go to the Auburndale Motel down Westshire Avenue. The guy who runs the place knows about that house, and he'll let you stay for a few days for free so you can get yourself back on your feet without worrying about your pocket change. I took a few steps back, gripping tighter around my bags, and was trying my best not to look so visibly angry at him. But my face must have betrayed me in some small detail. He could tell that I wasn't happy and said, "I live here. When you're ready to get out of there real quick, you can stay here for about a day. My wife might be a little grouchy, but she'll understand the situation." He handed me a quickly written note and took a few more steps back from me, concluding that this conversation was over. We exchanged goodbyes, but deep down I was hoping I wouldn't have to deal with him again. I'm not about to abandon my home over some silly town legend. Back home, I set everything down on the floor at the front door and went into the kitchen to see if I could cook up some coffee packets. I was going to need a triple shot espresso for this day. I had a lot of work to do with the pipes. This was easier said than done. Once I had my coffee and started working on some of the pipes down in the basement, I struggled to deal with all these weird items from companies stretching all the way back to the 30s. Vintage Coca-Cola cans, an old tire wheel that looks like it belonged to a car from the 20s, and a bunch of other garbage that I wasn't keen on keeping around. Although I think the can of Coca-Cola might be worth something. Once I got to work on the pipes, I took one off and saw that it was completely rusted through. Glad I brought the appropriate size for replacement. The real problem was how I was barely able to get any more pipes off. They were so rusted that a lot of them almost looked like they merged into one. There was also this sticky brownish goo that covered certain corners of the basement. One particularly nasty corner in the front right of the house was set with an organized circle of candles and a bowl filled with that brown goo. What exactly it was, I wasn't itching to find out. Part of me wanted to clean this stuff up, in case it was toxic, but then again, maybe I should hire some professionals to fix my house after all. I was losing motivation fast to try and deal with all these problems, and I just wanted my utilities back on. I did give up and walk back upstairs to make a few phone calls in the meantime, but I kept feeling an unusual chill down my spine every time I took a look out the back window of the kitchen. For a brief moment, I thought I saw lights blink through some of the trees. It was already dusk outside. The sun had gone down, but the light was still partially there. And what was even more frightening was that it looked like as if the blinking light was getting closer to my house. That night, those words from Nate haunted me. I locked my door because at this point I was having second guesses about staying here. How I wish he wouldn't have told me all that stuff. But thankfully, everything was quiet for the first few hours. I did manage to fall asleep until around 4 a.m. I say 4 a.m. because that's when I was interrupted from my sleep by a piercing elk scream. I jumped out of my bed. A rush of adrenaline hit me quick. That sounded like it was inside my house, but I heard a crashing sound down below. Going downstairs, I was about to go down to the basement, but realized that I needed a weapon if I was going to deal with a home intruder. I ran into the kitchen to grab a knife, but briefly glanced out the window and saw something rushing towards the cliff. Once it did, it started walking down the pathway that led down. In its hand was a staff with a candle-lit lantern attached at the top. It was draped in a cloak, with a hood obscuring its head from my limited field of vision. From what I could see poking out from the hood, 2 long tusks that were probably a foot long each. But I could have sworn that I saw something else. Something like a mask. An animal skull mask. But it was gone before I could even process what I was seeing in deeper detail. After that encounter, I quickly called 911. As I was waiting for them, I wanted to quickly check the basement. Going down there, I didn't see any of the windows broken, but I knew that he came down here because there were pieces of paper scattered all over the place, as well as one of the shelves that was attached to the walls being torn out. Creeped out by the darkness down here, and worried about my intruder coming back, I went back up and stayed outside in the front, waiting for the flashing lights. A cop did eventually show up. He looked apprehensive with his sunken blue eyes and a large mustache like Joseph Stalin. Honestly, though, he looked as if he was the man himself, but he had 3 scars around his neck that his collar wasn't covering.
Are you the homeowner?
I said yes to his question and was expecting him to do a quick search of the house, but he did not do anything of the sort, but instead proceeded to lecture me, which I was not expecting.
You decided to move into this house, huh? Hate to tell you this, son, but I already know that there's nothing we can do to help you.
I was practically taken aback by the inaction and lack of sympathy for what I had gone through. Excuse me? Someone broke into my house, and you weren't even going to try and figure out who or how they got in? He rolled his eyes, and with a raspy voice that told me that he was already done with his conversation, he said,
Did you see the suspect?
Kinda.
What did it look like?
Annoyed. The fact that he used the word it instead of him or them told me enough that this isn't the first time that the cops have been called out to this house before, and that they are well aware of the situation. They were wearing a cloak, I believe.
Yeah, so like I said, there is nothing that we can do to help you. Whatever this thing is, it's beyond our ability to handle. You're better off getting help from a private investigator, but I wouldn't count on it. A family tried that once, but they're all dead now. He spoke remorsefully. I wasn't able to talk back to this man. Frankly, he went back to his cop car and drove away. The apathy that I was experiencing was jarring, and I never expected the police to be so disconnected from my situation. But perhaps my intruder was something that the police were not equipped to deal with, and they decided that it wasn't worth the effort to even try. But that didn't make it any better, despite the rationale. Then I kept thinking about Nate. He told me something about how the town didn't like this house. Part of me felt that I should adhere to their fears about the home and jump ship. But I wasn't in the mood to try and start all over again. Maybe I should give it one more night and spend the day trying to figure out how that thing got into the basement to begin with. The next morning, I made it my mission to look around through the basement and figure out how this thing got in. From what I could remember, it stood on 2 legs and it was not going to garner any attention from the police. I wasn't in a position where I could move out immediately, and I wasn't ready to abandon the house yet. I had already spent the money on buying it, and I wasn't exactly keen on ending this. But no matter where I looked in the basement, I saw nothing except the piles of rubble and trash that littered and stacked up onto the walls. I spent possibly 3 hours just trying to look for something, but still, I saw that it was nothing but that brown goo and debris. I sat down on the steps, resting my head back uncomfortably, but having no will to try and go up the rest of them. I took deep breaths, my hands aching from hours of working with them. My God, this sucks, I muttered out in frustration.
I took a quick survey of the room around me, wondering if maybe I was going about this all wrong. Perhaps there was indeed a hole nearby. I've thought that maybe there was a window that was cluttered over, but perhaps there was actually a genuinely large hole that the creature was crawling through. So I spent about 2 hours throwing shelves and bookcases around, trying to clear away as much as I could from the walls. And after doing all that, I found nothing. I sighed defeatedly. Practically on the verge of tears, I gave up and went upstairs to rest in my bed. After all of that, I could not find any entrance as to how this creature came in, and a part of me had another fear working its way into me. Would it be back tonight? I didn't have a gun license, so naturally I didn't have a gun. I was going to have to use anything else that could be a weapon to handle this situation to the best of my abilities. Something blunt or something sharp would have to make do. To ease my mind, I went out to the town to grab some more tools to work with, and maybe even learn a little bit about my problem. Unfortunately, I wasn't ready to confront Nate about it again, so I guess you could say I went out to get a second opinion. I saw a church and knew that I could get some information from them. They had to have heard something about the house, since the building looked like it's been here for decades, possibly even a century. I never liked being in a religious building. To me, there was nothing great about these institutions. But I was desperate and needed answers. Hopefully, the next shovel I got will help with searching for holes in my basement. A pastor noticed that I was looking around and approached me. "Hello? Have you come to pray?" No, that wasn't the reason for my visit. I just have some questions about some town lore. I wouldn't have chosen this place for something like that. The library is always open to those who want valuable information about the town. I know, but I bought the house on the cliff. I was hoping that you'd have some knowledge about its history. His face grimaced as I could see the creases in his wrinkles folding as he looked as if he was overwhelmed with a wave of grief. His voice, at first as sweet as any friendly, sympathetic old man, deepened into a serious and slightly colder tone. "Get out of that house." He practically was ordering me. "Why, though?" "It's not necessarily the house that is the problem. It's just that it borders on the realm of something evil in the woods beneath those cliffs. A monster. A being so grotesque that it wiped out all Native American tribes in the area." I sat down on the stairs of the speaker's platform and listened as he explained further. In the late 1800s, when this town finally was going up, a rich man who was also an owner of the opium trade going on in China built one of his homes on that cliffside. The house you currently inhabit. For a few months, his staff reported that occasionally they would hear something in the basement or in the attic. Then, on one September afternoon, a gardener said he heard something at the edge of the pathway and decided to go check it out. He never returned. There was no screaming of any sort. It was just as if he wandered towards the edge, entered the domain of the woods down below, and vanished. I was curious about the Native Americans, so I asked him about their story. "Reports are sketchy. From what we know, they arrived here sometime in the 1400s. They only lasted about a year before their entire tribe was wiped out. They weren't even allowed to leave because a subsequent snowstorm ravaged the area and forced them to hunker down. During that time, their numbers were being whittled away by the creature in those woods." "What is it?" At this point, I was thinking that it would be something supernatural. This is a church, and this was a pastor, so I was expecting something that would coincide with his faith. "It is not from Earth. It came from the stars and landed here many thousands of years ago, devouring any life forms that come within the vicinity of those woods. And I hate to say, That house just so happens to be too close to its home. Well, I definitely wasn't expecting a pastor of all sorts to give me that answer. I would have expected an astronomer or biologist to give me that answer. Maybe more so a conspiracy theorist.
How do you know all that?
He looked away, as if he was ashamed as to how he came upon this knowledge.
My father took me hunting near those woods. We happened to get too close, and, well, that thing took my father from me. It ate him right in front of me. A 10-year-old.
He was crying a little.
I'm sorry to have to ask. But that's not all. As it mockingly killed my father, it also knew I was a believer and told me to give up on my faith because it was not from Earth. I can't say it was lying, but I can't say it was telling the truth. But it's been here for a long time, and we merely managed to outpopulate it into this area. How'd you escape?
His head shook, and with a deep breath, he said,
It let me go. Not out of mercy, but because it wanted me to live with the knowledge, I guess.
Is there nothing I can do to get it out?
Many tried. That rich man that I talked about earlier, his whole staff was eventually wiped out. He ended up gathering a search party to go into the woods and look for them, because the last thing he heard was that they were being dragged out towards those woods. The search party never returned either. Nothing and no one ever gets out, he said, matter-of-factly. I swallowed. I realized that I knew where this was going. Clearly, there had to be more to this story.
How many people have inhabited the house before me? He stroked his chin for a moment and contemplated what he was going to say next. I could tell he was not comfortable with what he had to say.
Dozens of people have come and gone. And by that, I mean they were viciously torn apart by something that hunts people like a ravenous animal, but has the intelligence of something far beyond human. I believe I remember someone, I think it was the cop. He said something about a family. There have been so many people who were unaware, believing that they were getting a good deal on such a fixer-upper house or just flipping it. But in the end, they became nothing more than another on the list of people in the obituaries. After hearing all of this, I thanked him for the information and realized I had to make a decision. Could I really go back to the house and face off against something that rattled everyone in this town down to their core fears? A monster that stalks and massacres any who try to make a home too close to it. Already, the day was getting late, and I decided to play a game of chance. I went back to the house to spend one more night. If I had another situation with the creature, I'll have to get out. But I'm going to keep all of my stuff packed, just to make sure. I still think I could keep this thing out of the house, if I could find out where it's hiding that hole in the basement. I kept poking around with the shovel, trying to see if I could cave in a secret entrance somewhere in the walls or on the floor. Still, I got nothing, and it was already getting late. There was no more light outside, and I was relying heavily on candles. I was about ready to quit, but I decided to take one more swing at the crumbling flooring. I lifted the shovel high, but accidentally hit the roof in the process. I had just rammed right through the floorboards on the first floor, and I was now really mad with my own stupid decision. Here I was destroying my house further, trying to figure out if something was getting in through the basement through a secret passage that no matter where I looked, it seemed impossible. There was nothing. All the walls were solid.
God, this sucks,
I shouted in frustration, and started swinging the shovel down hard onto the ground. I kept chipping away at the broken concrete until something caught my eye once my raging moment had passed. I lifted
and I moved closer towards a strange formation of different material that didn't match the aged concrete coloring.
Is that a...
It was. It was a skull. The lower jaw of a human skull. My heart was racing, and I was about ready to leave that room right then and there. Grab all my clothes, get out of the house, and go to that motel that I was told would be a safe place for me. But there was a vibration running through the floor, and all of the cans down here started to shake ever so slightly. Something was moving. I quickly ran behind one of the bookcases that I had pulled away from the wall and hid. As I said, I'm not all that religious, but let's just say that I was praying for certain this time. The room started to fill with hushed whispering. I covered my ears, but came to the horrifying realization that they were inside my head. When I peeked around the corner of the bookcase, the wall facing opposite to the stairs began to ripple like water. I honestly could not understand what was going on. But then, a long, skeletal hand pierced through the brick wall. Then the rest of the arm, and then the whole body came through. I left my candles burning still, so I was able to get a good look at the monstrosity that stood before me. I'd say it was around 6 feet, 5 inches. It had appendages that were mostly just bones, with only a little flesh keeping them attached to one another, mainly around the joints. But I did see something else. Whatever it was strapped in black shoulder plating, a large gray robe that covered its leather underarmor, and it had large, blood-soaked black boots. Its arms were long and fingers twice the length of a human finger. But even after all of this, its face was the most hideous part to look at. I was trembling just from the sight of its deer skull for a face, and where its eyes should be, blue light was emitting. It had 2 long tusks coming out from the sides of its lower jaw, and 2 long horns that were covering inwards towards each other, straight above its head. It started walking again, after taking its brief look around the room. I quickly retreated back behind the bookcase, hoping that it wasn't aware of my presence. It walked with a heavy clanking of metal boots. It went up the stairs, unaware of my existence, and it was scraping something metal against the rotten wood. When I peeked around the corner and saw that it had a long, broad sword in its left hand. I could hear it walking around on the first floor, opening doors. Now I knew for certain that it was looking for me. This was nothing more than a nightmare that I just wanted to wake up from. When I moved from my hiding place and was a little closer to the steps, I wondered how long it would take before the creature gave up. Then I heard it ascend to the next floor. I could hear the thrashing around of my stuff, and that is what was getting under my skin. It destroyed all my things, and now it's waiting for me. I'm not going to have it. I went up to the first floor, quietly. I then saw that I still had my gasoline tanks, which were originally meant for mowing the lawn, that I had left in the living room. With stealthy caution, I dumped the gasoline all over the first floor as quickly as I could. I was wondering what that creature was doing. I hadn't heard it since I got up here. Almost, I whispered to myself.
Almost what?
A deep, snake-like voice came from behind me. I jumped and dropped the gasoline tank. When I turned around, that thing was standing right behind me, lurking right over me. I took as many steps as I could towards the wall.
Attempting to burn down my house. Pathetic.
What are you? It moved closer with the clanking of its boots, making my heart jump with each step.
I am the eons beyond humanity's time on this world. I ruled this world first, until your kind started showing up. You relegate me to my small dwelling, and occasionally try to take that from me too. But I will not yield.
I'm sorry. I didn't know you lived here. I was on the verge of tears and trying to plead for some sort of mercy from this otherwise malicious entity.
It's no issue. I'm an outstanding fellow, but it just so happens that I have the taste for human flesh.
Realizing what that entailed, the creature opened its mouth wide and was about to take a huge chomp out of my face. But I ducked to my left, desperately hoping to find the matches in the kitchen. The creature howled like an angry elk, chasing after me, walking like a man. That alone was bizarre. Once in the kitchen, I grabbed the matches and kept trying to swipe at one. One of them failed, so I was forced to pull out another one as the creature increasingly closed the gap between us. It couldn't run, I guess, or maybe it was just confident it could catch me. Either way, I had to keep walking backwards out into the hallway that exited out into the dining room. We briefly walked around in circles around the dining room table, the creature holding up its sword and smashing it through. Finally, I managed to light the second one. When I dropped it down to the ground, hoping that this would be it for this thing, I didn't think this far ahead. I was still stuck in the house. In a panic, I used my shoe to quickly kill the flame, hoping that didn't catch any of the gasoline.
You're running out of matches.
It laughed. He was right. I only had one left. We went back into the kitchen, and the creature relaxed a little. I was almost insulted by how it was taking its leisurely time with me. I desperately kept trying to light another one, but no matter how many times I tried, nothing worked. It was dead. A dead match. My eyes were so fixated on this creature now, I couldn't run. I locked the door earlier, and that gave it the time it needed to grab me and finish me off. It was over for me. The creature laughed some more, sliding its sword across the tile flooring, and said,
How tragic. I will say you put up a better fight than most of my previous victims. For that, I will give you a warrior's way out of this life.
It slid its sword very fast to give me a quick chop, but a burst of flame erupted in the kitchen that was slowly traveling across the floor. When I thought about it, scraping the sword against the aged tile, he must have ended up causing sparks on the ground without even realizing it. It cried out in pain as its body was engulfed in flames. I, on the other hand, spent no more time there. I ran for the front door, glad that I didn't have the gasoline over this section. Once I was outside, I was able to catch my breath and turn around as the flames quickly engulfed the dried-up wood inside, and that creature was still wailing. It was over. Everything was over. After the whole incident, I was able to file for insurance. I'm so glad I went and got this when I first got the house. The story I went with was that one of my gasoline tanks fell over and there was an electrical fire. Thankfully, that story was able to stick. With the money that I was able to get, I was able to just move into a simple mobile home in a different town. This was much better, and there was no cosmic monster that was living close by in this town, thankfully. Despite what I believe I saw, I don't think that the creature died in the fire. I went back about a week after the whole place had burned to the ground. It was late at night, and I was just wanting to have a bit of reassurance that it was gone. When I went to the edge of the cliff, I looked down at the forest and thought about how beautiful it was. I was rather melancholy about the whole ordeal. How it would have been nice to have woken up every day to see such a beautiful sunrise. But something caught my eye for a brief moment. When I looked down below, I could have sworn I saw a bright light moving under the trees, like a lantern flashing through the leaves, followed by the call of an elk howling. It was Kev who dared me to go inside. "Wouldn't ask you to hang out if I knew you were such a pussy," he teased, exhaling thick plumes of smoke. Tom and Pete sniggered, weed giving them the giggles. Maybe I'd have been laughing too, if the hairs on my neck hadn't been standing bolt upright. I couldn't peel my eyes away from the rickety, decaying building in front of us. It must have been nice when it was first built, however many hundreds of years ago that was. Now it was just some rotten cabin that time had forgotten. The surrounding woods had claimed it as their own, trees growing alongside both walls, their reaching branches scratching against fusty timber. Half the outside was blackened with old fire damage or smothered in graffiti and vandalism. Flimsy mesh fencing ran around the perimeter of the house. Some failed attempt from the council to block it off, if I had to guess. Part of it had been cut open by past delinquents, the metal curling back to grant access. But we didn't even need it. Pete had pushed one of the loose panels over, tipping it onto the ground. You could drive a car through it now. Cripplejack Shack. That was what they called it. I always thought it was a myth, some story our dads had cooked up to scare us and stop us getting lost in the woods. Supposedly, decades ago, some boy called Jack had gone exploring inside the abandoned house and fell through the floorboards whilst upstairs. He'd broken both legs, or his arms, or his spine. The details changed depending on who told the story, but the end result was the same. He'd been crippled for life, and ended things for himself soon after. I'm not sure Cripplejack would fly in the modern age, but that was what my dad's generation called him. They even named the old house after him. The house that was, apparently, real. The joint passed to Tommy, who stepped next to me, surveying the house as he took a deep, considering drag. "I bet the door's locked anyway," he said, voice croaking as he held the smoke in his lungs. He twisted his mouth to one side to avoid blowing smoke in my face. "Only one way to find out," said Pete, eyes twinkling with sadistic joy. It always felt like Pete wanted to see me screw something up. Sometimes I wished the others weren't friends with him. With Kev and Tommy, I knew it was just banter, but Pete had some venom in him. Tommy took another heroic drag before offering me the joint. I'd already had enough, but I took it anyway, and gave it a half-hearted toke. Warm tingles were beginning to wrap around my head like an overly tight headband, and my thoughts began to loop a little, each repetition blurring into the next. I began to feel like the others were watching me. "Fine," I said. "I'll try the door." I'd barely taken 3 steps forward before Pete shouted, stopping me in my tracks. "Wait." My eyes shot up to the house, sweeping over the black, empty windows, expecting to see someone inside. Out of all of them, if Pete were telling me to wait, something must have been seriously wrong. But I couldn't see anything. I turned around as Pete stomped over to me. "Give me that," he said, snatching the joint from my fingers. "Oh," I muttered, sheepishly continuing my walk to the shack. Behind me, laughter oozed out of my 3 friends. Dead leaves and twigs crunched under my trainers. As I drew closer to the wooden cabin, I wished my friends would laugh again, or shout something. Anything to draw out the swaying skeletal trees around me, their barren branches scraping together in the winter wind. That same wind crept into the open holes of my clothes, and I tried my best not to shiver as the cabin loomed over me. I was regretting those last hits of weed now. My feet felt heavy, and I was convinced I wasn't walking properly, swaying more than the trees. Each step made the cabin look more imposing. Some extra detail came into focus, or some grimy aspect gained new, disgusting clarity. Paranoia drew shapes in the dark openings where windows should have been. They made me think of empty eye sockets on a skull, like the house was watching me. As though I were on a conveyor belt,
I kept moving. Crunch, crunch, crunch. I could smell the rot now. Damp wood, old ash, and piss. My hand hovered over the door handle. With the smell being so strong, I was willing to bet serious money that people had pissed all over it, or worse. Pulling down my sleeve, I used my hoodie to avoid touching the door with my skin. As I pressed down, I prayed that the door wouldn't open. If any gods had listened to my prayer, they ignored it. The door began to swing outward, on hinges so rusty it sounded like they were screaming. Without even thinking about it, I let go and stumbled back. The door kept swinging, though, gaining momentum and catching the wind. It clattered into the side of the cabin, and I flinched like a rabbit in a snare. Laughter from the trees let me know my friends had seen. I turned back to them, hoping maybe this was enough. Maybe I'd done enough. All three of them motioned for me to go inside, Pete's most insistent of all, like I belonged there. Like this horrible place was my home. I felt my face twisting up in anger and turned away from them. The open door was wrapped up tight in shadow. Despite the daylight trickling through the leafless canopy above, it was as black as dead coals beyond that doorframe. A hungry, gaping maw, waiting to swallow me. In and out. That was all I needed to do. Getting my feet to move was difficult, but once I started, I couldn't stop. With sleeves still pulled over my hand, I steadied myself on the doorframe as I passed over the threshold from light to darkness. It took my eyes a moment to adjust, and for a few horrifying seconds, all I could see was vague, black lines of what I assumed was a hallway, obscured by spots dancing in my vision. The coward in me realized I didn't need to go any further. My friends couldn't see me anymore. I could just wait here, then go back outside. They'd never know the difference. It was a lot warmer inside, with the rotten walls offering basic shelter, but the wind howling through the gaps in the house, almost whistling. The faint scratching of tree branches outside sounded like sharpening knives. In the darkness, each creak of wood or unexplained tap drew my full attention, like my ears were making up for my struggling vision. I could at least make out the outline of the room I stood in now, as well as guess at some of the shapes inside. An old cabin and a wooden chair, a broken coat rack, a bookcase with all its shelves missing. I was surprised there was anything left inside at all. Usually these abandoned places are barren, just empty beer bottles, rubbish, and some remnants of a fire. Emboldened by my improved eyesight, I decided to look inside one room, the nearest one. Floorboards creaked under my feet, and I was reminded of the story of Cripple Jack, hoping there wasn't a basement under these thin strips of old wood. I kept close to the walls, thinking that would probably be the safest place to tread. The wind outside picked up as I got closer to the open doorway I'd chosen to investigate. I couldn't feel any breeze, but the whole shack trembled with it, like some big bad wolf was trying to blow it down. I'd just placed my hand on the doorframe and was moving to peek around the corner when the wind died down, and I was left alone with another sound that made me freeze. Humming. A distant, throaty hum drifted from one of the open doorways ahead. I couldn't tell which one. It might have been the one I had my hand on. It might have been the one opposite that I now had my back to. With teeth clenched together, I found the urge to swallow or cough, that my dry mouth desperately wanted to do both. Someone was in the house with me. The humming wasn't loud enough to say for sure if it was a man or a woman, if they were young or old, but that quiet, vaguely melodic noise rooted me to the spot. I was too scared to even think. Then it grew louder, like whoever was making the sound had turned towards me, was moving towards me.
With wide eyes, I watched my hand unpeel itself from the doorframe and felt my feet step backwards, instinct carrying me towards the light outside. Floorboards creaked underfoot, threatening to rat me out, but the humming never stopped. It had a sickly sweetness to it, and made me think of fresh-baked pies sitting on a windowsill. Just as I neared the exit, my shoulder clattered inside the cabinet, and it rattled on its timber feet, rocking back and forth, but mercifully staying upright. I ran then, too close to the exit to risk staying, too frightened to stop and listen if the humming was still there. Outside, the light almost blinded me, but I still saw the black shape leap out at me. "Boo!" it shouted. I slipped, scrambling to get away from it, falling backwards and landing on the muddy forest floor with a painful thud. I kicked and yelled, frantically and desperately trying to get away from it, when a hand gripped my arm. "Zach," someone said above me. "Jesus Christ, Zach, calm down." The animal part of me vanished, and I was back in control of my body, panting fast and heavy, staring at my friends. Tommy held me by the arms and was trying to pull me up. Pete was hunched over, laughing so hard he almost fell. "What a pussy." "You okay, man?" asked Tommy. "Someone's inside," I wheezed, eyes darting towards the open doorway, shrouded in shadows. "I heard someone inside." It didn't stop Pete from laughing, but Tommy and Kev both glanced at the door before finally getting me to my feet. They shared a look before Kev's mouth spread into a toothy grin. "You had me for a second," Kev said, wagging a finger at me. "That's good." "No, I think he's serious," said Tommy, not taking his eyes off me, as I thought the truth could be found if he stared hard enough. Eventually, he gave up and glanced at the open doorway. "It's probably a tramp or something. Someone humming," I managed. My head was spinning, and my racing thoughts seemed so much louder than my voice. Tommy braced against me, and I tried to blink spots out of my vision. When I looked back up, Kev was moving cautiously through the doorway. I barely managed to open my mouth to object before he slipped through, joining the shadows. Pete followed him, still chuckling to himself and shaking his head. Tommy gave me an insistent nudge. "Come on, man." "No." I tried, but it was so weak, so quiet. "You're with us now," Tommy said, supporting me with his arms as he walked us both towards the doorway. "You'll be all right." I tried to say no again. As we trudged towards the doorway, my mouth wasn't working properly. Neither were my knees or my neck. They'd gone all floppy. My head rolled on my shoulders as Tommy pulled me through the gaping jaw of Cripple Jack's shack. "Guys," hissed Tommy, as darkness swallowed us. "I think Zach's whiteying." A chill passed through me. I could feel Tommy's hands clutching me through my hoodie, a little too tight, like he was worried I was going to collapse. "I'm not," I managed, draping an arm across Tommy, head lolling like I was a scarecrow taken from its pole. We were moving too fast. Too fast. Up ahead, blinding lights turned on us. I scrunched up my face, too weak to put my hands up and block the glaring light. One moved closer, the other turned away. Through squinted eyes, I watched the bright light approach, wondering what it was. "Yeah, he's ghosting," said Kev, turning around and hissing urgently into the hallway. "Pete." The light was Kev. I tried telling this to Tommy, but no words came out. I couldn't lift up my head very well. It was too heavy, but I could see now that Kev must have turned the torchlight on his phone on. Why hadn't I thought of that? "Where's he going?" Kev asked, still looking down the hall. He hissed again. "Pete." The other light drifted into one of the rooms down the hall and disappeared. I nodded and pointed. That one must be Pete. "I don't like Pete," I mumbled to Tommy.
"I know, buddy," said Tommy, comforting me like a child. Kev bit off a snarl and stomped down the hallway. He turned into the same room Pete had gone inside, taking the light with him. Tommy fumbled in his pocket, darkness and keeping me standing making things difficult for him. After a moment, light bloomed into the room. Tommy had his phone out, camera flash illuminating our surroundings. "Why didn't I think of that?" I muttered to the floorboards. Then, after a bit of reflection, I added, "I don't feel very good." Tommy adjusted his grip on me, struggling with his phone. "You're gonna be okay. It'll pass." Icy chills passed along my face, taking the warmth out of all the tingles the weed had given me before. I realized what Tommy had been saying before. I was whiteying. White's death. When you have too much weed and go all faint, pale, and weak. I certainly felt like death. Strange little mumbles escaped me, and my head swayed around, spinning along with this rotten room. "What the hell?" I heard Tommy whisper. And then I heard it. That humming from before. I'd almost forgotten about it. Now it almost felt comforting. It was a soothing sort of melody, like a mother might coo to her baby. Tommy's grip got pincer tight, pinching and twisting my skin through my hoodie. He lifted his phone to illuminate the hallway ahead. Although it was blinding when shown directly in my eyes, the light did little to reveal the contents of the empty corridor. But we both saw the thing that was humming. It swept from one unexplored doorway to another, following Kev and Pete into the room I'd almost walked inside. We only got the barest glimpse before Tommy fumbled his phone and it clattered to the floor. Whatever it was skeleton thin, with ghostly white hair trailing past its shoulders. By the time Tommy managed to scoop up his phone and shine the light back down the hall, it was gone. With no noise coming from the others, Tommy did something very brave and very foolish. He followed it. Sometimes I wonder if I could have done things differently, pulled Tommy back, or just ran away. But that wasn't what I did. Left alone in the darkness, the world still spinning, I shambled after my friend. I wasn't being brave. I was just too scared to stay on my own. By the time I caught up, Tommy stood in the doorway, shining his light into the room. I poked my head around the frame, getting my first good look inside the room. It was hard to see anything but the person humming, cast in harsh spotlights by 3 camera phones. Kev, Pete, and Tommy, all dumbstruck, all speechless, each of us just watching in horror as a gaunt, decrepit old woman stood with her back to us, stirring a pot of rotten food on a rusty stove, still humming. Somehow acting completely oblivious to us. Although most of her was covered in damp and dingy rags, it was clear she was malnourished to the point of near starvation. "What?" Tommy whispered after what felt like a lifetime. Even this simple word seemed to rouse the others. I couldn't make out their expressions from behind their beams of light, but from the way they bobbed and moved, I could tell silent escape plans were being formed. Even in my own sorry state, questions bubbled in my mind, almost overwhelming me. Who was this woman? What was she doing here? Did she know we were in the room? Has she been here all this time, just cooking rotten food in the pitch darkness? It was too much. With the darkness, with the fear, with my thoughts reverberating against the walls of my skull. Everything swayed around me, like a flushed toilet, and I threw my guts up. At least I had enough wits to avoid Tommy's shoes. The others didn't seem to notice. "Hey!" snapped Pete, waving dramatically at the old woman. She just kept humming and stirring. I heard Kev hiss at Pete to shut up, and there was a scuffle as he tried to drag him back. "Hey!" "Pete, shut the hell up,"
Hey, crackhead, I'm talking to you. With bleary eyes and a slack jaw, I watched Pete walk into the spotlight made by the others' phones. He tapped the old woman's shoulder, not hard, just enough to get her attention. She didn't react, but Kev did, jumping in and pulling Pete away. I expected them to argue, but they both fell silent, their arms slumping to their sides, light cast downwards, so only their legs and the floorboards were illuminated. Tommy took an uncertain step forwards. I reached out for him, not wanting to leave the light of his phone. Anything but the darkness. He motioned at the others to come outside, hissed their names, but they didn't move. Biting off a curse, he marched forwards, keeping well away from the humming old woman. Once more, I stumbled after her like a lost puppy. I was outside his cone of light now, and could almost feel the shadows on my skin. He snatched Kev's arm and tried to drag him out, but the moment he touched him, his own arms sagged to his side, too, the phone tumbling from his hands to the dirty floor. Light splashed around the room, giving me front-row seats as the old woman turned and took my hand. I flailed like a fish in a net, her fingers slithered between mine. It was cold and dirty, and as though somebody had drawn the curtains, daylight spilled into the room. It was a kitchen. I could see that now. Radiating light bloomed all around, taking all the dirt and grime away. The cookpot crackled with the sweet smell of stew and spices. Now that she had turned around, now that I could see her face in the daylight, I could see this woman wasn't old at all. Perhaps in her 40s. Her fingers were still wrapped around mine. She was warm and clean. She looked into my eyes with motherly concern, tangles of blonde hair framing her slender cheekbones. I gazed back at her, blinking slow and stupid. Her lips pouted for the briefest moment before she spoke, her accent foreign and unfamiliar.
This phone is sick, yeah.
Her voice would make honey taste bitter. Each word made my brain tingle. 3 boys muttered agreements, all at once. My friends. I had forgotten they were in the room, too. "He's whitey," said Tommy. "Too much weed," agreed Pete. "We all had some," admitted Kev. She cupped my chin and shook her head.
You boys.
She tutted, before motioning to the table.
Sit.
3 chairs scraped along glimmering oak floorboards as my friends abruptly seated themselves. The woman released my chin and returned to her cooking, slowly stirring the pot. It smelled wonderful.
My name is Grenval,
she said, bringing the wooden spoon to her lips and tasting her food.
Was ist yours?
Voices swirled together, and we all tried to answer at once. Even tangled up as I was, I still murmured my own name, hoping for Grenval to place her hand on my chin again. She opened a cupboard at her side and pulled out some bowls. Her humming resumed as she ladled out the food, and as we waited for our meal, I cast my eyes around the kitchen. It was hard to believe I'd been scared before. This cottage, or whatever it was immaculate, bathed in sunlight. As I swayed in place and looked at my friends, broad smiles painted across their faces, Tommy with his eyes blissfully closed, I tried to remember what had been so frightening. The clatter of bowls being placed on the table snapped me out of my daydream, and I marveled at Grenval's grace. Her clothes were very strange, I realized. Perhaps I'd been so mesmerized by her pretty face that I'd not noticed them, but I did find myself frowning at those rags she draped herself in. They did nothing to complement her toned figure. Perhaps she was younger than 40.
Eat,
she said to the others.
Weist is hot.
My friends didn't need telling twice. They scooped up their spoons and set to work, eyes fixed on Grenval. As she swept towards me, she took my head in both hands.
None for you. Not yet. You will only sick it up.
She drew a finger down my nose, then tapped it playfully, making me smile like a fool. She leaned in closer, then closer still. Her breath smelled like flowers, warm against my skin. She leaned closer to me, gazing into my eyes, until I thought she was going to kiss me.
You're wondering why I wear these clothes, she said quietly after a moment. Perhaps I should change.
Kev's spoon clattered on the table, and I turned to see all three of them gawping at her. Soup dripped from their open mouths, all golden and chunky. She turned away from me, and her lips curled into a secretive smile. For a second, I found myself hating them all. That had been my moment with Grenval, and they were stealing it. With a heavy scowl plastered over my face, I met Tommy's eye, and his goofy smile slipped. Some deep, distant part of me knew it wasn't his fault, and I felt my own expression soften.
Who will help me change?
Grenval asked, sauntering past me and out of the kitchen door.
I will,
said Kev, throwing his bowl down and jumping out of his seat.
Me,
shouted Pete, standing up so quickly his chair toppled backwards. My head was too blurry to let me form any words, and Tommy was still staring at me with a puzzled look, like he'd been given a math problem that was too complicated to solve. The other two raced each other out of the room, scrambling past me. Silence loomed over me and Tommy, and I missed Grenval. Clutching his head, Tommy stared around the room, still with that same baffled look on his face. What was he so worried about? We had both been worried before, I remember, but that was because it was so dark and dirty and... I looked around the room, at the cast-iron stove, fire still gently crackling. It had been rusty, hadn't it? An herbal smell still played around my nose, the sweet, lingering stench of soup. But hadn't the food been rotten? And the humming woman, hadn't she been old? My stomach plunged into nothingness, and I shivered. For a second, a cloud must have covered the sun, because the room dimmed slightly. But then it was gone. Warm tingles returned across my entire body. My eyes fell on Tommy again, and he wrinkled up his face, blinking slow and heavy, like he was trying to clean dirt from his eyes.
What?
Tommy began, his words slurring.
Where are we?
I licked my lips, not knowing the answer. Wobbling in place, I gazed up at the rafters, then tried to look out of the window, but the light was too bright.
The kitchen,
I shrugged.
Grenval's kitchen.
I smiled then, thinking of her soft touch and pleasing tone. Tommy smiled too. Then we both laughed, my eyes darting to the doorway, hoping to see her, but there was nobody there. My feet had been rooted to the spot for what felt like forever, but now I stumbled over to the table, using both hands to steady myself as I sat opposite Tommy. The leftover soup in front of me looked too inviting to resist, but as I clutched the spoon, Tommy grabbed my hand.
Don't eat that,
he mumbled. Tommy didn't look very good. Sweat dripped from his forehead, and he kept twitching.
This isn't,
he muttered, puffing out his cheeks, gripping the table with both hands.
We aren't.
I looked down at my soup. For a split second, it looked black, like dead leaves and old mud. But it was just soup. I could still see it, smell it. Just soup.
Someone's feeling better?
A voice cooed playfully from the doorway. Smile stretching across my lips, I turned over to see Grenval completely naked. Her skin was deeply tanned, her body sleek and smooth. I'd thought her beautiful before, but this was something else entirely. She had no belly button or nipples, but none of that seems to matter. I leaned so far forwards I almost fell out of my chair. "We picked your clothes," said Pete, with more pride than I'd ever thought possible. Both him and Kev lingered behind her, jostling with nervous excitement.
"Now,"
Grenval said, scooping up a kettle and gliding towards the table.
"Who wants tea?"
All of us except for Tommy said we did. He still had his head in his hands. As Grenval placed the kettle atop the gentle flame of the stove, she cast a disapproving eye over him.
"Thomas, you haven't eaten your soup."
With fingers spread wide, frozen in the act of pushing himself away from the table, Tommy looked like he would rather eat anything else in the world. His chin kept tilting towards Grenval before snapping back, as though he were wrestling with himself. I began to get that sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach again, like something was very, very wrong. But as my eyes drifted away from Tommy and back to Grenval's toned, naked body, I wondered what on earth could be wrong.
"Help him, Peter,"
she said, still with her eyes watching Tommy. Without needing further encouragement, Pete stomped over and snatched up a spoonful of soup, trying to force it into Tommy's mouth. Tommy grabbed his hand and tried to wrestle him off. Wordlessly, they grunted and struggled. The kettle began to whistle, rising and piercing.
"What is wrong, Thomas?"
Grenval asked.
"Aren't you hungry?"
Pete wrenched him from his seat, throwing him to the ground and placing a knee on his chest. He jabbed the food at Tommy's mouth, but Tommy kept his lips clamped shut, shaking his head furiously. For some reason, I started crying. Grenval went to my side then, hand on my shoulder, my hands drifting around her. Her skin was so warm and smooth. It made me think of leather, but somehow that felt so right. I stood up, lost in the intensity of her gaze. The commotion on the floor seemed so very far away. She appeared to approve of my hands on her and encouraged further exploration. She moved my fingers down each protruding rib along her waist, settling on her pelvis, which jutted out under taut skin. Her smile made it all seem perfect. My fingers found a piece of bone that had broken past the skin, and now I gave it closer attention. There were more dotted across her body. Black bones, all knobbly and wet. I prodded one, and it squelched back inside, oozing with grimy pus. A hand seized my throat, and I tripped over my chair, toppling backwards onto the floorboards. Kev was on top of me, and pain erupted across my face as he punched me square in the nose. "She's mine," he screamed through clenched teeth. His fist rained down on me in hammer blows, smashing my head back against the floorboards. But I kicked him off out of sheer instinct. He collided with the table, sending the bowls leaping into the air. One shattered on the ground. As I lay on my back, gulping for air, Kev picked himself up and aimed a kick at my head. I barely managed to get out of the way and grabbed hold of his other leg, tugging it as hard as I could. Kev toppled over, and we desperately grappled, punching and rolling on the floor. Tommy and Pete were still fighting too, descending to punches, the spoonful of soup long forgotten. Above us all, Grenval hummed that same tune, the kettle screeching as it reached boiling point. "You can't have her," Kev spat, battering an elbow into my teeth. I managed to hook my leg around his neck and wrenched him backwards. All my blurriness and weakness were gone, beaten out of me. I wanted to win. I wanted to claim my prize. The kettle whined itself to silence, and Grenval took it off the flame, pouring hot liquid into cups. My fingers were in Kev's eyes, and we rolled across the oak floorboards, grunting in frustration at the other's refusal to die. Continual wet, crunching splats from the other side of the room declared there was a unanimous victor of the other fight.
"That is quite enough," said Grenval, once she had poured the last cup of tea. Me and Kev released each other, collapsing on our backs, chests heaving. Pete stopped punching Tommy and got to his feet, panting like a hungry wolf, blood dripping from his knuckles. Gracefully drifting across the room, Grenval handed Pete a cup and embraced him. His free hand slithered down her spine, fingers bobbing on each bony bump. On the floor, my face twisted into bitter hatred, and I could feel Kev seething next to me. With Pete still clinging onto her, Grenval scooped up 2 more cups and placed them next to us on the floor. Ignoring my tea, I pushed myself onto my feet. It wasn't fair. I hadn't finished touching her. Barely able to stand, I tried to reach for her, but she intercepted my wandering hand. The look she gave me didn't need any words. Pete had won. Snatching my hand back, I stared down at Tommy. Blood pooled around his head, which had split in places it shouldn't have. Scattering of teeth ruined the glimmer of the oak beneath him. His chest wasn't rising and falling like it should have been. I stared down at his limp body and tried to remember. There was a time before all this, wasn't there? Where Tommy was my friend, possibly my only friend. He was brave and foolish and... "We are going to read now."
A sweet voice tickled my ear. I turned and saw a flicker of truth. The cabin. 3 upturned phone lights barely fighting off the shadows. Bowls filled with half-eaten black grime. Kev on the floor, still struggling to breathe, sludge smeared across his lips. Pete being led away, hand in hand with a gaunt, skeletal old woman, her pale flesh pierced with rotten bits of wood. In that moment, I knew. Somehow I knew. That's all she was. No bones, no muscles, no nerves, just a jumble of rotten wood, black decaying sticks, with skin stretched around them. The moment I thought about it, she snapped her head to look at me, twisting so quickly it would have broken her spine. I was plunged back into daylight, and everything was forgotten.
"Drink your tea,"
said Grenval, swaying her hips as she led Pete from the room. I watched her sultry movements and felt my cheeks burn with jealousy. Kev did as she said, but as I raised the cup to my lips, my eyes fell once more on Tommy's corpse. I lifted my cup, but kept my mouth clamped shut in a vice grip. The hot liquid pooled against my upper lip, and I pretended to drink. With his empty cup, Kev left the kitchen, and I followed him. It was just as bright and elegant in the rest of the house. The corridor branched off into other rooms, with lacquered floors and jade green walls. Hanging upon the wall was a little wicker man that caught my eye. The twigs were knobbly, black, and looked like they were bleeding. Before I could think too much about it, I saw the shape of Grenval, leading Pete towards a bedchamber. The door between us closed of its own accord. Her voice still floated around us, giving us further instructions.
"Upstairs,"
she said.
"Quickly now."
Before I had even processed her words, Kev had pushed me out of the way and started running. At the end of the corridor was a mahogany staircase, spiraling upward to the top floor. I placed my hand on the banister rail, polished to a sheen. It felt rough beneath my fingers, all gritty and moss-covered. It was jarring to run my hand down the smooth, glimmering wood, whilst splinters and dirt scratched against my palm. My eyes and hands didn't agree. Still, I could hear Kev's excited footsteps as he reached the top, stomping on the floorboards above. Something was wrong about this place, but I couldn't remember what.
Climbing the stairs, I was unable to take my curious fingers off the banister. My dizziness had gone now, but there was a vague rancid taste on my tongue, like you get after you've been sick. Had I been sick? I couldn't remember. The upper floor was just as bright and lovely as the lower. There was a bedroom up here too. But my eyes were drawn to the library and its occupant. We had a library at school, but it was dusty and boring. This place gleamed, each colorful spine of a book calling out to me, pleading to be read. They ascended higher and higher, up into the rafters, piled atop one another. I doubted it would be possible to fit a single extra book on those shelves. Kev was also inside, but his eyes didn't wander the shelves. They were fixed on a woman who, I could only assume, was the librarian. She was a large woman, more than double the width of Grandval, and yet she possessed that same feminine grace. She had a hungry sort of smile, with plump, rosy red cheeks. But there was no doubt what had truly captured mine and Kev's attention was her colossal bosom. Each breast was larger than her head. As she stepped closer, her entire dress swayed from side to side with the sheer weight of them, leaving little to the imagination and making my throat dry.
So it was you boys making all that commotion,
she said, humor tickling the edges of her voice and making goofy smiles spread onto both our faces. We both nodded.
And now Grandval has sent you to me,
she said, stepping closer and running a hand across our chests. Kev seems to enjoy every moment, but once again, I found my sense of sight and touch disagreeing. I saw plump but delicate fingers teasing and enticing. A woman who knew exactly what she was doing, all full of promises. What I felt was something heavy and crude slam into my chest. Most of it touched my clothes, but one stray finger caught the skin of my neck. It was rougher than the banister had been, but also damp. It dragged down my body, and I felt bile rise in my throat. That was when the smell hit. I'd once found a 3-week-old pork mince in my brother's fridge, all gray and rotten, with fust growing on it. That was my closest comparison for the stench that played in my nostrils now. The flicker came all at once, my entire brain desperately clawing for the truth. We were in the shack. The room was almost pitch black, but some remnants of daylight broke through the gaps in the boarded-up windows. The place was barren, all empty shelves. There were 2 shapes in front of me, silhouetted in the darkness. One was Kev, looking no different in this vision or the other. But there was another shape, shambling around the room. Bloated, hairless. It was too dark to make out any features, just the vague shape of it, big enough to fit both me and Kev inside 3 times over. The floorboards creaked painfully beneath its slow, steady footsteps. As it waddled into a small ray of dim light, I could see its deathly white skin glistening and wet. The only color was in its swollen bluish-green veins. The stench was so overpowering I could taste it, clogging my throat. But I think the worst thing was the noise it made. Somewhere between a rasp and a gurgle, wheezing and grunting, like the mere act of being alive was painful. It spoke then, not in English, not in any language I recognized at all. It sounded like it was choking on its own tongue, or chewing it. All I could do was try not to cry, but Kev actually replied, shouting out with boyish enthusiasm. "I will." He scrambled away, disappearing into the darkness. There was a clatter as he fumbled around the shelves, reaching for books that didn't exist. My legs almost collapsed as I remembered the fight. Tommy downstairs in a pool of his own blood. The tears I'd been holding back came then. The bloated shape of the librarian turns to me, shambling closer and speaking that same garbled language. It almost sounded like a question. The room was so dark I could only really see her when she moved.
Stepping backwards, I bumped into the doorframe, trying to keep out of the librarian's reach. As the bulk of her shifted, I could see the knobbled black shapes of dead twigs piercing her skin, the wounds weeping with glistening black blood. With each step, there wasn't this heavy flap of flesh and muscle, but the rustle of twigs and leaves. She spoke again, twisting her head backwards to Kev, almost like she was calling over her shoulder. The fumbling at the back of the room stopped. Then footsteps. Faster, louder, running towards me. Kev was tangled in a lie, but he was in a world of daylight. I was blind. In sheer panic, I fled, not even knowing where I was going or even where I was. Almost instantly, I tripped on something in the darkness. I hit the floor hard, and there was a crunch of rotten wood. The world gave way, and I plunged, colliding with something hard. Pain shot up both legs, dust and debris swirling around me. Still blind, coughing and sputtering, wind and sense completely knocked out of me. Still in the grasp of primal fear, I tried to stand, but my knees wouldn't work. Wiping my eyes, I looked up and realized I was in the hallway, where I'd first entered. The open door to the outside was right in front of me. Whimpering from the pain in my legs, I crawled, pulling myself inch by inch towards the exit. I got closer, barely able to see anything but a white square through the tears in my eyes. I begged and prayed to get out. Just let me live. Please, just let me live. Blinking my eyes clear, I could see the trees outside. Then something stepped between me and the door. Thin, skeletal legs with pale, dead skin, pockmarked with protruding twigs. Dry, black blood was smeared around each wound, but it weeped with dirty water. "Grenval," I whispered. "Please." Above me, something spoke. It wasn't the librarian. It wasn't either of the sweet voices I'd heard in the daylight world. It rasped and sputtered, mangling a painful sort of English. The hiss of the dead.
We have what we need.
It bent over, and something stabbed into my side. Slow, deep, sharp pain that bled into my entire body. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped me. Grenval spoke again.
1 year, you will return.
That was all I remember. I suppose I blacked out, but I must have managed to get outside, because they found me about 100 meters away from the shack. There was a trail in the mud where I'd dragged myself, apparently. I was taken to the hospital with a laundry list of injuries. Fractured vertebrae, broken femur, snapped tibia, and 2 broken ribs. They hope with physical therapy and time I'll be able to walk again someday. I'd fallen from the upper floor of Cripple Jack's shack and had drugs in my system. The weed I obviously knew about, but the psilocybin and opiates were news to me. They never found Tommy's body. Kev and Pete are still missing. A full forensic sweep of the shack proved we'd been inside, but nothing more. It will probably go without saying that nobody believed my story. Just 4 teenagers, high as kites and exploring an abandoned cabin in the woods. It's been sealed off again, properly this time, with new metal hoarding around apparently. I've gotten no desire to see for myself. The local kids have a new name for the place now. Junkie Zach Shack. I don't think it's got quite the same ring to it, but it's not stopping it spreading around the whole town. Who knows? Maybe it'll scare some kids off drugs. Though, I doubt it. I wish that was the end of the story. Very soon, it will be 1 year from that day we went inside the shack. With 1 week to go, I had a particularly vivid dream. Cripple Jack's shack, the door slowly opening. Just before the threshold, before stepping into shadow, there was a wicker man upon the floor. The tiny figure was built from familiar, dead black twigs. But even that wasn't what awoke me in a cold sweat. No,
That was the number underneath, laid out in the same rotten timber sticks. 7. Last night I had the same dream, only this time the number was one less. I have a feeling that tonight will be the same. 1 year, Grenval had told me, you will return. I think something similar happened to Cripple Jack all those years ago. If it did, I know why Cripple Jack took his own life. There is no way I am going back.
I have heard for many years now that some animals have a sixth sense. They can sense danger, natural disasters, and/or changes in weather, among many other things. Like geese flying south for the winter, like cows lying down when it's about to rain, and that dogs can see spirits. You know, ghosts. I can somewhat believe the first two, because, after all, I've actually seen them. I never believed the seeing ghosts thing about dogs. I never believed in ghosts, spirits, or anything paranormal, as a matter of fact. That is, until recently. About a week ago, my wife, Barbara, and I, my name's Tom, by the way, we had planned a nice, relaxing day at the beach, given the fact that we just so happened to be off on the same day. It's something that rarely ever happens. My wife is a teller at the bank in town, and I am the night manager at Wally World, a department store in town as well. Anyway, we finally had a day off together. My wife had packed a picnic lunch. You know, sandwiches, chips, little pieces of fruits, and a cooler full of sodas and water, as well as 2 travel mugs of coffee, one for her and one for me. We were ready for Shower Beach. That's not the real name of it, though, but it does rhyme with the real name. We just call it that to amuse ourselves, and because it has a full shower facility on site. We also brought our dog, Gremlin. Gremlin is a 2-year-old Chihuahua/Terrier mix, brown and white, about 15 pounds, and an absolute mama's boy. He follows my wife everywhere. The kitchen when she's cooking dinner, the bathroom when she showers. He even has his own chair at the dinner table, next to her, of course. He's not spoiled. No, not at all. Anyway, he decided that he was going to come with us. It was about 8:30 in the morning. I grabbed the cooler and basket and headed for the door. My wife grabbed her purse, the travel mugs, and a blanket, then held the door open for me. Apparently, Gremlin saw the purse and the open door. He knew exactly what that meant. He's a very smart dog. I guess he decided that he was going to go bye-bye too, ran out the door, almost tripping me, and sat by the passenger side door of the truck. You guessed it, my wife's door. I loaded the stuff in the back of the Blazer as my wife opened her door. "Yes, Gremmy, you can come too," she said, smiling. Gremlin got in, wagging his tail. My wife got in herself, as I did the same. All 3 of us then made the 45-minute drive to Shower Beach. Gremlin sat on my wife's lap, of course, and went to sleep. My wife and I talked, laughed, and listened to music. Not any kind of music. No, her kind of music. Michael Bolton music. When we got to the beach, I had the overwhelming urge to listen to Slayer, Metallica, or even Ozzy, just to get my manhood back. In any case, we got to the beach, unloaded the truck, went down to the sand, and enjoyed the next 4 hours, spending time together, running around playing with the dog, getting our feet wet in the water, eating lunch, and relaxing on the blanket. Gremlin as well. I was lying there with my eyes closed. My wife was doing the same as Gremlin sat there checking out the girl dogs, I assume. Now, I'm sure many, if not all of you, have been to the beach at some point in your life, and you've laid down and closed your eyes.
You can still feel the heat from the sun beating down on you, right? Well, as I lie there, sun beating down on me, it suddenly faded into a brisk blanket of cold air. I opened my eyes to see the sky quickly turning gray and a large patch of intensely black clouds off in the distance. I tapped my wife on the shoulder to get her attention and said, "There's a bad storm coming, babe. We gotta get out of here." She looked up at the sky and quickly agreed. We grabbed all of our belongings and ran to the truck, as well as many other people on the beach. Gremlin right beside us. We threw the stuff in the back of the truck and quickly hopped in. Gremlin jumped in the back seats and laid down, which was odd. I started the car and began driving out of the parking lot. The fog then rolled in, completely out of nowhere. And I'm not talking a little bit of fog. No, I'm talking barely can see an inch in front of your car fog. There was no fog when we were down on the sand. Where did this crap come from? I thought to myself. The best way I can describe it is that it looked like a scenario from that Stephen King movie, The Mist, only worse. I drove like a snail, creeping down the road, barely able to see where I was going. You could see lightning bolts flashing within the fog and hear thunder booming in the distance. It never rained, though, which was odd. Gremlin began to whine just a little bit.
"It's okay, boy,"
my wife said to him, then turned around, reaching between the seats, and rubbed his head.
"Want to come sit with Mom?"
she asked him. Gremlin did not move, which was very odd. "Okay," my wife said, then turned back around. About 20 minutes into driving in the fog, it just disappeared. Just like that. The fog was gone, and the day was bright and sunny again. I couldn't even see it in my rearview mirror. The image shown in the mirror was that of a bright, sunny day, like the fog or the storm never existed.
"Where did the fog go?"
my wife asked. "I don't know, but that kind of creeped me out," I answered. Gremlin then barked from the back seat. I guess it creeped him out too. We drove for about 10 more minutes, passing familiar buildings, gas stations, and other businesses. Now, brace yourself. This is where it gets weird. You see, my wife and I made this trip to and from Shower Beach many, many times before, so we know the layout of the road pretty well. I mean, where all the stoplights are, places to eat, gas stations, and landmarks. But we did not remember what came next. As I was driving along, talking to my wife, not really paying attention to the road, we suddenly came upon a stoplight that was never there before, at the beginning of what should have been an old dirt field, but was now an old, run-down cemetery. I slammed on the brakes to avoid running the red light. Gremlin slid off the back seat. He hit the floor, stood up, shook it off, jumped back on the seat, and barked, as if he was calling me a moron.
"Where did that cemetery come from, Tom?"
my wife asked, slightly confused. I don't know, I replied. Maybe we just missed it on the way down. But ain't it awesome?
"Yeah, maybe. But it is awesome. Let's stop,"
she replied. Now, you have to understand that my wife and I are both history buffs. We love history. You can call us sick if you want to, but sometimes we like to just walk around old cemeteries and look at the dates on the headstones, just for fun. And this cemetery was old. You could tell because it was completely surrounded by an old black iron fence about 10 feet high, and all the headstones were made of stone, not granite or bronze like they are nowadays. I put on my right turn signal and got in the turning lane. As soon as I did, Gremlin put his paws on the armrest of the back passenger side door, staring out the window, and whined loudly.
I then drove about 30 yards to the entrance of the cemetery. Gremlin began whining more intensely. "What's the matter, boy?" I asked, stopping the car at the entrance. He turned his head quickly, and I swear he looked me dead straight in the eyes, growled, then barked, as if he was trying to tell me something. In retrospect, I should have listened. The entrance had 2 large square gray pillars on either side of the road with huge gray gargoyles on top. A black iron half-moon sign stretched across the top of the pillars, connecting the 2 together, with the words Robert Belz Memorial Cemetery written on it. Since the cemetery's entrance was located directly on the road, there was nowhere to park the truck. I had to pull in. As soon as I pulled in, Gremlin began to bark repeatedly, running back and forth on the back seat, hitting the doors as he did. "Gremmy, stop!" my wife yelled, and she never yells at him. He didn't stop. He just kept running and barking. "He'll be fine," I said, and got out of the truck. My wife did the same. Now, the air should have been hot, given it was bright and sunny outside. But it was not. The air inside the cemetery was cold. I'm talking goosebumps cold. We walked to the back of the truck, opened the hatch, and each grabbed a fleece throw-on that we kept in the back, just in case. We put on our fleeces, and I shut the hatch. We closed the trunk doors, leaving the windows down around 2 inches so Gremlin could get some air, and began walking through the cemetery, looking at the headstones.
"I got 1735,
my wife said. "Cool. Here's one that says 1437, I said. "Can you believe that? Take a picture of me and the stone. Please, babe? I've never seen one this far back." She then pulled out her phone and took the picture. "I'll check it out later. Let's keep going." We could hear Gremlin growling and barking in the distance, going completely insane. It wasn't a, "yeah, mommy's home," happy bark. It was a, "if I catch you, I'm gonna kill you" bark. We walked a few more feet when my wife turns to me and said, "I'm worried about Graham. Look at him. He's never acted like this before." Her eyes then began to tear up. Now, you have to understand that Gremlin is a very laid-back kind of dog, and for him to be acting this way was not normal at all. "Yeah," I said. "Something's spooking him. Poor guy. Let's go. We'll come back another time." My wife agreed, and we quickly made our way back to the truck. We got in, took our fleeces off, and began to drive home. Gremlin stopped barking as much, laid down on the passenger side of the back seat, and growled quietly as he stared at the other side of the street and barked on occasion. He totally ignored my wife when she tried to talk to him. That was really, really odd. When we got home and got out of the truck, Gremlin refused to get out, so much so that I had to physically scoop him up and carry him in the house. I put him down once we got inside, and he just stood there, looking at the front door intensely. It was about 5:30 at this point. My wife and I decided to have TV dinners for dinner and to watch a couple movies on Netflix. My wife prepared the food while I set up the TV trays. Gremlin still stayed at the door. About halfway through the first movie, Gremlin again began to bark angrily at the door, then took off, like a bat out of hell, toward the kitchen. My wife and I just looked at each other. We quickly got up and ran to the kitchen when we heard Gremlin yelp several times and heard the sound of dishes and glassware breaking. I turned on the light as we both walked in to see Gremlin lying down in the doorway, eyes wide, staring up at the ceiling, showing teeth, but not growling. Every single cabinet door and drawer were wide open. Multiple pieces of plates, saucers, and glasses lie broken on the kitchen floor. "What the hell?"
I said. "I don't know," my wife replied. My wife replied, then shook her head. "I've had enough for today. I'm tired. I want to go lay down," she said. "Okay, I'll be up in a minute. I want to clean this up real quick," I said. Gremlin then got up and walked with my wife, looking back to the kitchen on occasion. I swept up all the broken pieces, put them in the trash, shut the cabinet doors and the drawers, then shut off the light. As the light went off, I saw what looked like an old woman standing by the back door. I just shrugged it off as bad lighting, then went upstairs to lay down. I walked in our bedroom, and Gremlin was lying at the foot of the bed, staring at the door, instead of snuggling with my wife like he always does. What's going on with him? I thought, and laid down too. The next morning, the alarm on my phone woke me up at 5 a.m. like it always does. My wife didn't have to be at work until 9, so I wanted to let her sleep. Gremlin as well. It did not happen that way. I stumbled down the stairs. When I got about 3 or 4 steps from the bottom, I heard a voice, or what sounded like a voice, in my right ear, saying something I couldn't understand. What? I thought, then quickly dismissed it as people outside. I turned the corner to see my dining room table turned upside down, with the 6 chairs positioned like a pyramid on top of it. Strange writings and even stranger symbols carved into the wall. The chandelier was ripped down, wires hanging from the ceiling and thrown into the back of the couch, ripping it to shreds. "Barbara!" I yelled, as loud as I could, then felt incredibly cold for just a few seconds, then back to normal. My wife came staggering down the stairs in a hurry, Gremlin in tow. "What?" she said. "It's gotta be the wind or a truck going by. Something. There's gotta be an explanation for this," I said, completely frazzled. I moved the chairs, turned the table right side up, then put the chairs back in place. I then grabbed the chandelier, took it out back, and tossed it into the trash. I came back inside, walked into the kitchen, turned the coffee pot on, then sat at the bottom of the stairs, trying to rationalize what was going on. My wife joined me, after letting Gremlin out front to go to the restroom, or whatever he does in the morning, then letting him back in. He made a beeline for his food and water bowls, ate some food, drank some water, then sat at my wife's feet. When the coffee pot beeped, I made us each a cup of coffee, and we sat on the stairs talking, drinking coffee until it was time for Barbara to get ready for work. She got up and said, "I'll be right back, babe. I gotta get dressed." I nodded my head as I took a drink of my coffee. She then turned and began walking up the stairs. I turned to watch her do so. Gremlin followed close behind. She reached the top of the stairs, turning right and disappearing out of sight. Suddenly, my wife screamed, a blood-curdling and terrifying scream as Gremlin began barking viciously and growling once again.
"Tom."
I heard my wife scream as I heard the sound of a door being slammed shut. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, turning to see Gremlin barking, growling, and clawing at our bedroom door, trying to get in. My wife screamed again as the sound of wood breaking could be heard, then a loud thud on the floor.
"Tom."
My wife screamed again, more fearful this time. I tried the doorknob, but it was locked or stuck or something. I then began slamming my shoulders into the door, screaming, "Barbara!" Gremlin going completely insane.
"Tom,
My wife screamed again.
help me."
Another loud thud. After the 3rd or 4th try, I finally managed to break the door down. I rushed in to a huge gust of wind blowing in my bedroom, like a whirlpool. Several pieces of paper, chunks of wood,
Small knickknacks and various other items were caught in it and spinning in the air. I had to shield myself from getting hit. Gremlin tried running to the bed, but was caught in the wind and slammed hard into the chair. I looked to my left to see Barbara pinned back first against the wall, her arms spread out, her head back, gasping for air, and about 3 inches off the ground, like someone or something was holding her up. "Barbara!" I screamed, and began to fight the winds to get my wife. Suddenly, an ear-piercing screech was heard, which morphed into words.
She's mine,
The voice said, as this incredibly grotesque, for lack of a better term, person began to appear in front of my wife as the wind died down, the items falling to the floor. I was frozen for a second. This person was dressed in an old white robe that was tattered and frayed at the edges. Its entire body was void of any flesh, only the decaying skeletal frame. Its nose and eyes were just black holes that had what appeared to be worms crawling out of them. Its mouth had about 5 broken, decaying teeth in it. This person's right arm was holding my wife off the ground. It was completely transparent.
get out.
It screamed demonically. Gremlin then barked so viciously that it actually scared me. Before I could even move, Gremlin jumped from the chair to the bed, then leaped at this person. It then shrieked another ear-piercing shriek and completely disappeared. Gremlin landing on all fours on the floor as my wife fell into the fetal position, trying to catch her breath. Gremlin quickly running over to her and licking her face. I quickly ran over to her as well, making sure she was all right, and picked her up in a fireman's carry. "Grimmy, let's go," I said loudly as I ran out of the bedroom and down the stairs, my wife in my arms, Gremlin right behind me. When I got to the bottom of the stairs and turned the corner, Gremlin then passed me, stopping at the front door, and began barking again. "What is it, Grem?" I asked. He barked a few more times and stepped towards the door. I thought it was that old, dead woman again.
"Police department, open up."
I heard a deep, raspy voice say. Gremlin then sat down. I walked over to the door, opened it, still holding my wife. "We gotta get out of here," I said, and pushed past the officer as I laid my wife down on the grass, Gremlin now sitting by her side. "We are reports of domestic violence happening at this residence. Now back away from the woman," the officer said sternly. I looked at my wife. She nodded her head, and I backed away. Gremlin stayed put. I spent the next 45 minutes explaining to the cops what had happened as the EMTs tended to my wife and found she was okay, just a bit shaken up. Gremlin still by her side. The cops then spoke to her. She confirmed my story. They didn't believe us and actually told me that they believed that my wife is covering for me because she's afraid. I would never put hands on my wife. Ever. After the cops and EMTs left, my wife and I, as well as Gremlin, agreed that we were not going to stay here anymore. We got in the truck, backed out of the driveway, and left it all behind. Free house if anyone wants it, ghost included. I called the landlord and told him we were leaving. He wished me good luck and hung up the phone. I didn't tell him about the ghost or the damage. My wife and I both called our jobs and told them we were involved in a traumatic event and needed a few days off. They both agreed. We rented a room at the local hotel for a week or so until we found another place, and Gremlin is back to being a mama's boy. We never did find out why the ghost wanted my wife. Yesterday, my wife, myself, and Gremlin made the trip downstate to see if that cemetery was still there. This time, no Michael Bolton. It was motley crew all the way down and back home.
Anyway, the cemetery was not there. Just a dirt field like it was before. I don't know what that place was, and don't want to know. Last night, I finally checked out that picture that my wife took at the cemetery. And if you look really close, you can barely make out the face and the body of that person standing behind the headstone. She deleted that picture immediately, and we are never going date hunting at a cemetery again. Now, if I learned anything from this experience, it's that ghosts are real, and dogs can see them, even if the human eye can't. So the next time your dog is barking at nothing, ask yourself this question. Is this really nothing, or is it something you just can't see? Look, darling, isn't the snow beautiful tonight? She said nothing, simply remained stiff in the aged wooden chair. He smiled and continued to sip from his mug of hot chocolate. He found her cold, silent demeanor adorable, one of a number of things he had come to find irresistible about her. She just sat there, staring with an expression of permanent fright back at him from in front of the window. Behind her, he could see the white specks as they fell in a slow, soothing flurry. He looked up at the ancient grandfather clock. 11:30 p.m. He smiled and whispered to her, "Not much longer, my sweet Delilah." He got up and made his way to the blaze in the hearth. He began pouring himself some more of the piping hot cocoa before looking back to the window, meeting gaze once more into her faded baby blue eyes. "Why don't you have a mug, my love?" Still, only silence served to answer his offer. He softly grunted in amusement before then closing the top of the kettle. He took another sip as he continued to watch her. God, how she looks so beautiful. Delilah, the sole warmth of his heart, sitting silent and peaceful on the old chair of antique mahogany, shrouded in the old white gown he had seen on her since first setting eyes on her. He always thought it made her look akin to the paintings of the Virgin Mary herself. God, if only he were a painter, he would sometimes think. He'd create a masterpiece from this scene alone to rival Dali or Da Vinci. If he were a writer, he'd create a tale with more potent emotion than even Poe at his most dreary or bleak. As the snow continued to fall outside, he could feel the air in the small den area become colder, even if just ever so slightly. "Why don't you come sit with me by the fire?" he said, as he started to stoke the blaze in the furnace until the heat from its dance upon the oak kindling returned. Still, she merely sat in her chair in front of the window. With a warm smile, he sat down his mug of hot chocolate and went over to the window. "Here," he said, as he began trying to push the chair from behind over to the hearth. "Allow me." About 2 or 3 feet from the hearth, Delilah began to slump forward until she'd fallen from her chair. "Oh dear," he exclaimed, chuckling. He shivered again, feeling the unnatural chill pervade the room around. "Come now, Delilah. There's no need to be upset. It'll all come together soon." Fixing her back upright, he continued to push the chair the rest of the way to the hearth. "Now, isn't that much better, dear?" She was still as silent as ever, yet her face could say both everything and nothing at the same time. Her eyes glinted with the reflective glow of the flame's wild dance, which served to also illuminate the rest of her pale, distraught face. Even as it looked now, defined in much of its morbid detail by the flames, he still felt hopelessly entranced by her face. He checked the clock again before rummaging around in his shirt pocket. 11:40. From his shirt pocket, he produced a small, wilted mistletoe. He sighed, the grim cloud of reality accentuating itself to him once again.
He'd come to both look forward to, as well as dread, this night. Christmas Eve. It wasn't quite time yet. Soon it would all be over, but not yet. Attempting to void this cloud from his mind, he stuffed the small mistletoe back into his pocket and walked over to the table beside the window, and placed one of the untitled recordings onto the phonograph, and placed the needle onto its third track. It was one of his favorite tunes that began playing, though, for his own reasons unknown, he could never remember the name of the composition or its composer. "Would you care to dance to pass the time, my love?" He walked over to the chair and took her soft, cold hand before shifting her to her feet. Now standing before him, the cloud of anxiety tightened its grip on him. "You look beautiful, my dearest Delilah," he said, with a shaking voice. He could hear her voice resonate distantly within the back of his mind, sounding as though it were echoing from the peak of a mountain.
"In life or in death, I will always have your heart, Arthur. And kiss me will be the sole warmth of your body, your heart, and your soul."
Slowly, carefully, he began to shuffle around to the room with her limply hanging in his arms. He tried, of course, to keep her braced upright against his chest, to no effect. In spite of this, though, he merely waltzed on with her, still smiling warmly to her. The longer he stared into those two stiff, oceanic-hued irises, the more those horrible, maddening memories returned to him. Memories of that first fateful night he lost himself to the lust for his dearest Delilah. The night that would spell the beginning of his own undoing. He could almost see it now, in every exact detail, looking into her cold, frozen eyes, the long walk down the icy road, the night sky, the gas-lighted lamps that stood to sparsely pepper the white-blanketed ground with their dim glows. It was deathly cold that night, only just over a month to the day before now, and he was walking alone from another evening, toiling at the local market. He had made this very same walk many a night before, but this was different for him. How, he could not have then known exactly. Nevertheless, something had changed in an almost supernatural manner in his mind that night. It had become very late when he saw her for the first time. There, by the street lamp, she stood, shrouded in a dress as white as the very snow. And oh, those eyes. Those baby blue eyes that immediately seized him and kept him spellbound. He felt a sense of tranquil warmth spread through his body with the image of that first shy smile she gave him when she saw him. That smile of fragile innocence, and yet of a cunning nature. He saw that she was trying to hang something from the top of the post when he began to approach her. When he drew near, he could see that it was a mistletoe that she was attempting to hang, the very same one he now kept in his pocket as he danced on. "Hello there," he greeted. "Is it not just a tad early for those?" She responded with that same playful, sly grin and replied,
"The heart doesn't lie, and my heart tells me the time is just right."
"The time for what?" he asked, confused. She giggled.
"The time for one's heart to be warmed by a lover's kiss."
He wasn't quite sure what she meant, but he somehow felt she was right. He could see she was struggling to hang the mistletoe. She gave him that softly sweet smile and handed him the mistletoe. He then hung it from the top of the gas-fueled street lamp. "There we are. Hung where you and all others can see." Her smile widened as she chuckled.
"You know what they say?"
She asked him in a balmy, almost seductive tone. He looked to her, intrigued.
"The mistletoe is deadly if you eat it, but a kiss is even deadlier if you mean it."
He laughed before losing himself once again into her eyes. Even as cold as it had become, he felt an extreme sense of warmth pass through him. It was as though he were next to a bonfire, and he even began to unfasten his winter garbs. Before he could do or say anything, she placed a slim, tender hand upon his chest. Instantly, a cavalcade of emotions ran down in a torrential downpour inside of him. Suddenly, all perception of the world around him was lost. He continued to lose more of himself into her eyes, those light, baby blue whirlpools.
What's your name?
He said nothing. He could only barely perceive the sound of her voice.
What's your name, sir?
Still transfixed in her stare, he gibbered out, Arthur. She smiled and continued to caress his chest tenderly, now working her hands up and around his neck. She looked up to the mistletoe and then back to him, her grin growing.
Will you kiss me, Arthur?
She cooed.
Kiss me, Neath the Mistletoe?
His body began to act before his mind would register their actions. Slowly he began to lean down to her, his eyes feeling heavier and heavier with each inch. Finally, their lips met, and he felt as though he were locked in an angel's embrace. She would break the union first, turning away to leave with no words except to say,
I'll be waiting for you, love.
He stood, frozen, still spellbound. Eventually, his stupor broke, and he found himself stupefied, unaware of where he was or what had happened. In that moment, only one thing was certain. He was extremely cold. Such would remain the case for the remainder of the eve. It was that night, curled under his comforter, that he would see her face again. He would hear her voice again, the ever so seductive sound.
Kiss me, Arthur. Kiss me, Neath the Mistletoe.
Such feverish infatuation, mixed triflingly with the deathly cold, robbed him utterly of sleep that night, and well into the coming morning. And this would carry on for the rest of that week until, eventually, he no longer saw her in his dreams. Her face and her voice had faded into little more than an obscure set of features and sounds he never could quite put together. That was until that Sunday evening, when he was once again returning home from the market, passing by that very same street lamp. And, as if expectantly, there she stood again by the street lamp, with mistletoe hanging from its top, shrouded in her same white gown, beckoning him to her with those eyes. And there it was again, that warmth that spread through his body, the earth that had felt entirely absent since that night for reasons he could never place.
I knew you'd come,
she said, bearing that same seductive smile from before. He froze, trapped once again in her snare. Absently, he began to trudge towards her. When he reached her, she once more unfastened his garbs and began caressing his chest. He could only stand and watch her, his mind completely blank.
My God, Arthur, you're so cold.
Her voice, while still sultry and smooth, took on an almost motherly tone when she spoke. Indeed, he felt like a child again, warmed by her preternatural touch.
Let me warm you with a kiss.
Again her hands slithered up from his chest and around his neck, and he instinctively lowered himself again to meet her lips. And again did the overpowering heat inside him flare. She would break away again, and again he would be left alone by the street lamp with only a fragmented sense of recollection of what had transpired. That night, too, resulted in restlessness. That night, writhing in his bed, Arthur would dream of snow, of the gas lamp, of her beautiful eyes, her beautiful face, of the mistletoe. The mistletoe. Deadly if you eat it, deadlier if you mean it. He could take it no more. He had to find this woman, this elusive temptress. Throwing on his heaviest winter garbs, he set out amid the bitter cold night air. The year's snowfall had begun to rain down earlier that afternoon, and had by then formed into a thick, white blanket upon the ground. Slowly, he staggered through the snow until he came once more upon the street lamp. His legs were unable to hold themselves up any longer, and he fell to his knees in front of it, the mistletoe hanging down, jeering at him. His sight began to blur, as with each fleeting, labored breath. The winter air had done its damage, and now he would feel its bitter touch slowly pluck the life from him. First, he would lose any feeling he had in nearly every part of his body. Next, he would feel the ice slowly form over his eyes, shutting him out from his sight. Just before the vicious winter would have him, however, he began to see the vague outline of a figure gliding towards him. He, of course, couldn't distinguish any definition from the figure, outside of the apparently human outline. The approaching figure almost seemed to blend with the surrounding snow. Only the long, crimson hair braided around the figure's neck gave him clarity. It was her. Or was it? As the figure approached closer, he began to notice more and more details that differentiated it from the dame he so feverishly sought. This new woman, while very similar in many of her features to the other, had much more pale, almost desiccated skin. Had he still the feeling in his body, Arthur would have begun sprinting for dear life. He could only lie and wait for this gruesome spectre to have her way with him. He could feel his heart thunder and quake against his chest with every inch she gracefully floated across the snow. He wanted desperately to at least close his eyes, sparing himself the sight of whatever horror he would face at her whims when she finally reached him. She froze before him, staring down to him with eyes that were only a faded resemblance of the baby blue gems he'd been entranced by. The spectre knelt down to him and placed its pale, bony index finger on his lips. To his amazement, the spectre's finger wasn't cold or frigid as he would have expected from one who looked as gravely as she. Rather, he felt the wave of heat begin to pervade him again. She then seized, cupping his chin in her frail hands, and leaned in to kiss him. Instantly, all feeling returned to his limbs. He then stood up as he watched the spectre turn to leave. "Wait," he exclaimed. She stopped and turned her pale, dead face to him once more. "Who are you?" She turned slowly before rushing to him in a startling fluid motion that was too quick for him to perceive. She was upon him again and, taking him firmly by the throat, whispered into his ear in almost too soft a whisper.
I'm the warmth of your heart, the blazing fire in your chest, that you can never again live without.
With that, she released him, and he watched her vanish far into the horizon before he could even blink. Just as before, he was left alone and bewildered, unable to remember what had just happened or why he'd even come. The only thing he was able to remember were fragments of a face, the face of a beautiful woman, as well as the face of a ghastly corpse. Along with this, Arthur could hear a soft, rasping whisper swim through his mind. The voice was, of course, utterly indeterminate, without any sort of identity or definition to its origin.
A kiss from my lips will now and always be what keeps thy heart warm and beating, lest it submit to a cold, bitter end.
That night was when his dreams of her first became vivid and clear. He saw her again, standing amid the snow, giving him that same dubious smile indicative of sinful desire. And looking upon this face, he fell helplessly into her whims and slowly walked to her. The snow began to flurry from above, and he could feel the chill begin crippling him again. The temptress extended her hand and curled her fingers to beckon him closer.
Will you dance with me, Arthur?
His pace quickened as his heart raced with both excitement and apprehension until, eventually, he broke into a sprint to her. To him, she seemed so close, and at the same time so far away the further he sprinted. At last, he reached her, and was promptly seized into her embrace. And like he was now in his living room with her, they waltzed about amid the white expansion. All the while, his attention was fixed to her radiant smile, augmented by those baby blue irises.
Kiss me, Arthur.
She croons to him with that angelic voice. He closed his eyes and leaned into her with anticipation. Likewise, she would yield her lips to him, and he felt the intensity of the sun burst within him. Slowly, however, he watched in growing fear as her face slowly devolved into that familiarly haunting necrotic visage that plagued his subconscious mind. Aghast, he shoved her away and attempted to flee. Something caught his feet, and he fell prostrate into the snow. She was once more upon him, leering down to him with those cold, dead eyes. She kneeled down and reached her hands down to him, clutching something small and frail in her withered hand. Shaking, he looked to see that it was a small mistletoe.
You're so cold, Arthur.
She rasped in a ghoulish hiss.
Come, warm your heart with my lips, love.
No, go away, he exclaimed, as he felt the crippling chill return, once more causing his blood to begin to freeze solid. All throughout his body, he slowly lost all sensations of touch, and his eyes started to freeze over again. Her lips opened once more, and she spoke.
You can't deny me long. Without me, your heart, your soul, will rot in a cold, icy bath.
As the darkness would have him, Arthur watched as the ghost, poising the mistletoe high above them, leaned forward to his right ear and whispered,
I'll be waiting, love.
It was in that instant that he awoke, bolt upright, with a frightened shriek. For a long time, Arthur just sat there, gasping frantically as though he were a fish being held above the water. Eventually, he was able to regain his composure. Yet he still felt wrong. It was more of an empty sensation, like he'd had something removed from within him. What, however, or why, however, were questions that continued to elude him. But whatever it was, it would cause him to feel perpetually cold for many days and nights to come, regardless of what he wore or how close he would sit by the blazing hearth. One thing did slowly mold into at least a minute's certainty to him. One way or another, this strange phenomena presently plaguing him was likely due to some sorcerous whim of this beautiful yet mysterious dame that dominated his subconscious mind. Unable to sleep, Arthur pondered how he may be able to rid himself of this apparently strange curse, eventually concluding that, no matter how strong his desire for her was, he would not heed her summons. Such proved to not be as easy as he had thought, however. Every day from rise until fall of the sun, the phantom chills would menace him without end. Constantly, he felt as though his blood had been turned to solid ice, despite at almost all times wearing his heaviest of garbs. Arthur would spend most of each following afternoon over these next 3.5 weeks huddled next to his hearth, constantly stoking the kindling to draw more heat from it. He would only eat scalding broth and lightly prepped stews with steaming cups of tea or coffee or cocoa. In spite of all of this, still, he was always so deathly cold, inside and out. Eventually, on the Monday of the week before now, he ran out of these commodities and was forced to venture out against the wrath of the cold. He had very little money by then, having received word early that past weekend that he'd lost his job at the market due to his seclusion. Still, he had to find some way to banish the bitter cold that was crippling him. It was as he trudged through the snowbound streets of the market that, amidst the many folks who'd likewise gathered at the market that evening, his eyes fell upon her. She was standing at the bakery, her luscious crimson-braided hair facing out to him, hanging down her back. Almost instantly, a nauseating dread flooded through him.
You need me, Arthur.
He could hear from deep in the pit of his subconscious.
You need my lips. I can feel it. Come, Arthur. Come to the mistletoe. Come and hold me and kiss me.
No, no more, he screamed. Almost all eyes from the present congregation were now fixed to him, frightened and bewildered. Oblivious to the attention he'd garnered, Arthur swiftly bolted to the young woman in front of the bakery, the seductress, the witch. With startling strength and intensity, he seized her by her shoulders and proceeded to violently shake her. "What have you done to me?" he barked to her frightened face. Her eyes were wide and afraid, welling to the brim with tears.
Who are you?
Though he could see the fear molded into the young woman's face, he would not relent. "What do you want from me, devil?" She screamed and struggled frantically to free herself, to no use. Arthur was determined to end this madness that was robbing him of his body, mind, and his very soul. It would end there and now, even if it meant the death of him. "Answer me! Why have you plagued me like this?" "Let the lady go," demanded a nearby bystander in a gruff voice. A broad-shouldered man attired in thick animal fur garbs, indicative of woodland residency. Despite his historical frenzy, Arthur recognized the man to be none other than McDowell, the town's lumberjack. "She's a witch!" Arthur exclaimed to the crowd as McDowell pried him away from the distressed woman and began dragging him out of the market square. "She's afflicting me with some sort of curse. Please, you must believe me. She's trying to rob me of my soul." The crowd merely looked upon him with disgust and shame. Though, as he was being forcefully towed away, he thought, no, he swore he could see the young woman's shocked face twist into one of sinister exultation. His own flailing against McDowell's restraints were feeble at best, not impeding his iron grasp in the least. Finally, Arthur was cast face down into the snow. "Stay down, if you know what's good for you," he heard McDowell demand before turning and making his way back to the market square. Laying in the frigid snow, Arthur's mind was lost in a maelstrom that bordered on confusion, fear, and pure madness. Why is she doing this to me? What does she want from me? Why don't they believe me? Tried as he might, no answers came to him, pushing him further to the edge of complete collapse. Making the matter worse was that he felt the chill now with more potency than ever. It wasn't long before he'd succumb to the elements yet again, unconsciousness assuming full control over his mind. And the first image to assault his hollow dream was, of course, her, leering over and jeering.
In life or in death, your heart will always be mine, Arthur.
He desperately tried to rid her presence from his mind, to no purpose. Regardless of how much he would try to banish her from thought and memory, he would be met only with her pale, dead face. "No, stay away," she simply remained, curling a beckoning finger with one hand, the other holding the mistletoe aloft.
Join me under the mistletoe, Arthur. Come.
Arthur's eyes went wide as he saw his body turn to ice. All too soon was he encased in a layer of frigid, unforgiving glacier. He could only watch in perpetual terror as the spectral woman approached him.
You can't elude me, Arthur.
Teasing the spectre in its raspy whisper, poising her decayed index finger at his heart.
Without me, you will only crumble.
With a light tap of her finger upon his chest, the ice splintered and started to crumble. And helpless, he could only watch, horrified, while he fell apart. Finally, his body had been reduced to nothing more than shards of glassy ice, only his head remaining whole. Yet, Even still, he was forced to watch as the spectre picked up his head and, holding that damning mistletoe high above, brought her faded gray lips to meet his. Arthur awoke again with a scream. Frantically, he patted all over his body to find that he was still whole, and the spectre was nowhere to be found. Even still, relief wouldn't find him, as he was still menaced by the chill. He could hardly move his limbs, and he was profusely trembling from hypothermia. He wanted to cry, both from the crippling madness as well as bitter fear. He had no doubt would have done so, had the air not been so cruel with its wintry wrath as to freeze the tears as they welled. With every minute reserve of strength he would have, Arthur found himself to his feet and began stiffly shambling to his house. It was as he crossed into that familiar road to his house that he saw her, again, walking all alone. Instantly, he could feel the urge again to rush to her and try again to force her to relieve him of whatever spell or curse she cast upon him. It was this frightful determination, and this alone seemed to fuel his stride. She didn't seem to notice him approach. It was perfect, he thought. He could sneak upon her, ambush her, and be on his way with none the wiser. He would be rid of this curse at last. Thoughts fell in an avalanche of how he could force her to relieve him of his torment. He was prepared to even do the worst if it came to it. After all, she's all alone now. It would be so easy, wouldn't it? Just a quick snap of her fragile little neck, and it'll all be over. And that was all he could care about. To finally be rid of this phantasmic witch and her damn accursed mistletoe. It wasn't long before he was then upon her. "Witch, I have you now," he said venomously. When she turns to him, exposing those all too familiar baby blues that appeared frozen in fright, he knew he had her finally at his mercy. He knew he would finally end this madness. She quickly tried to hurry into her home and shut out her pursuer, but she was too little too late. Arthur caught the door as it was about to close on him and forced his way inside. When she tried to run to the back of her house, he caught her and rudely threw her to the floor. He was then upon her again with his hands like pythons around her throat, forcing the air from her lungs and commanding her to undo her wicked sorcery. It was, in more than one way, invigorating. He felt as though he were a wolf and she a cornered sheep. The look of utter fear in her eyes fueled him. Now he would bend her to his whim. "Whatever you've done to me, witch, it ends now."
I haven't.
She choked out, but it was no use. Arthur's strangulation had by then rendered her speech impotent. Frantically, she claws like an animal at his face, trying to gouge his eyes. Nevertheless, Arthur's wrath was little impeded. In her wild flailing, her arm brushed the nearby drawer, knocking something off. Even amidst his primal state, he was able to see that it was a small, frail mistletoe. "Mistletoe," he barked with lunatic laughter as he began forcing it down her throat. "Deadly if you eat it." Slowly, he watched the life leave her eyes. Yes, he knew he'd won now. It'll all be over. Just one quick snap. He rose triumphantly, the adrenaline still coursing through him. He'd done it. It was over. It was all over. The witch was... He stopped. Suddenly, his exultation died and was replaced with another feeling. Panic. He looked down again at the woman's inert body, now with a growing panic. What have I done? He tried to shake her, desperately hoping that she may yet exhibit life. She did not, and Arthur now felt his head began to spin. What was he to do? He killed her. He was now a murderer. The court would have him hanged for sure. He'd be condemned as a cold-blooded monster. But no, that wasn't what happened, was it? She was a witch, was she not? Had she not wrought mystery upon his life? What he did was for the good of his own soul, wasn't it? In a brief, devastating avalanche, he began to remember her eyes, those hypnotic irises so wan with fear. All at once, drags of recrimination and despair caused him to huddle himself in a fetal position, sobbing.
Arthur.
He heard the voice only faintly, but enough to recognize it.
Arthur.
No, that's not possible, he stammered. All too soon, then, did he feel that haunting cold infect his body once more. Crippled once again, he listened in terror as the wraith's voice appeared to close in around him with its ghastly, rasping hiss.
In life or in death, I have your heart. I will keep it warm with me, even in hell. It will belong to me, and me alone, forever and always.
Arthur's body was trembling more violently than ever before now. No, you're dead. As if on cue, he saw the woman's body suddenly bolt upright. Her face was now the very same as that of the spectre, with her vibrant blue eyes now forever faded in death.
Kiss me, Arthur.
She croaked as she began crawling towards him with disjointed motion. Arthur opened his mouth, yet not a sound was able to be uttered. Only pitiful croaks of fright were sounded before she was upon him, pinning him to the wooden floor. Leering over him, she then began to open her mouth and croak as she painfully regurgitated the mistletoe onto him, now black and withered.
Come, won't you kiss me, love?
Before he could react, her pale, dead hands roughly seized his face, and her cold lips forced their way to his. This time, the warm sensation from before was not present, only the frigid touch of death and decay. He struggled until finally throwing her off of him. She was sent hurtling into the wall with a crash, and she was once again motionless, lifeless. He simply laid on his back, too frightened to move in spite of his spiked adrenaline, gasping frantically for breath. When he finally looked over, he was met with her dead face, forever chiseled in perpetual fright. Reflexively, he touched his own lips, finding that they still felt as they had before, cracked and chapped as they were from exposure to the unforgiving cold. Still, he had felt her lips, hadn't he? Arthur clutched his head and howled as he began stuffing his head into the wooden floor. "Please," his mind screamed. "Please, merciful Lord, make it end." Eventually, he could bring himself to pound the floor no more. And that was when he clawed like an animal off to the woman's battered corpse. "Why are you doing this to me?" This time, there was no answer. She merely stared back to him with stiff, faded eyes. He began shaking her, crying out for an answer. It was when he was again met with only silence that his terrified sobbing devolved into a fit of hysterical laughter. He collapsed onto his back, the corpse held firmly against him, as the laughter soon escalated into wailing cackles of raving madness that echoed throughout the house. In a morbid way, it was hilarious to him. The utter folly of it all. What began with a simple kiss had now delved into the black recesses of insanity. He was once a man, respected by the people. He was a well-liked market clerk, adorned by those he served. Now he was a madman, a lunatic, and now, worst of all, a murderer. He carried on his demented cheer until his throat was shot and his breaths became labored. Slowly, he could feel the chill again. His mind now gone forever, broken beyond all repair, He unfastened his shirt and trousers before climbing onto her, mounting the withered mistletoe above. If it wasn't him she wanted, she would have him. All of him. It would be days before reality would finally break through his madness. He sat that night, the eve of Christmas, staring into her dead eyes. He knew he couldn't live on like this, a prisoner to the curse of his own madness, to Delilah. The chill's grasp tightened and crippled him again. That was when it came to him of what he would have to do. He went into the basement of the house and retrieved a bucket of the kerosene meant for the lamps, and set about all night, dousing every inch of the house with it. Every wall, every corner, and every room was dredged, leaving none to be spared. As he toiled feverishly, her words continued to cycle incessantly, and the supernatural chill amplified in its ferocity.
You need my lips. I can feel it. Come, Arthur. Come to the mistletoe.
Despite this, he didn't stop until the breaking of the new sunrise, when he had finally completed his task. Tonight, he swore to himself, this will all end tonight. 12 loud chimes broke Arthur of his mad remiss. It was time. Steadily, he placed Delilah back into her chair and silenced the phonograph. He now felt more deathly cold than ever before. Still, this didn't deter him. With the last of the kerosene, he doused himself and her before stringing the mistletoe to the ceiling. He then stood her up once more, embracing her to him, before using the poker to cast out a burning log, setting the floors alight. All too quickly did the flames dance, consume the floors and the walls around them. Even amidst the inferno, however, Arthur still felt none of its warmth. He knew only one thing would, and it would be for the last time. "Merry Christmas, Delilah," he said, as he held her in an eternal embrace and brought his lips to hers. Even as the flames crept upon them, charring flesh and bone, he did not waver. He would die with his heart in eternal warmth. For even in death, she would always be the sole warmth of his heart.